Hi, everyone.
Hello. Can y'all hear me? Chat. Hello. Anybody there? Yeah. Okay. There are people. Okay. Audio's good. Okay. Great. If at any point y'all are like, oh, one person is too loud and one person is too soft, please say as much and I can fix it. All right. So
I'm
let's.
always too loud.
No, they're here to hear you. They're nobody. They hear me way too much. They're probably sick of me. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Lorebeards. We have a really special episode here today because we've got the one and only Andy Law with us, and I am extremely excited for this. Me and him were talking just a little bit earlier that he has been involved in the hobby and Warhammer space for quite some time. I was not yet among us human beings when he was still out there getting things done. So to say that, over 30 years experience with the Warhammer IP, which is just crazy and amazing. So if you wouldn't mind kind of introducing yourself to people that might not be familiar with your work here in the chat, and then we'll kind of get into stuff.
I'll do. Okay, right. My name is Andy Law. I have been working in Warhammer for one way or another pretty much since I was born, or at least that's how it feels. I started by joining Games Workshop after opening my own store, ran around there for a little bit, jumped out and then started working as a freelance, where I worked on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay primarily, and I ended up doing writing for that, maps for that, and eventually writing the most current edition of the game, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, 4th edition. I've worked for Black Library, Games Workshop, and a bajillion others on the side. As a freelancer, I've worked for people like Critical Role, you may have heard of, who do big D&D Twitch streams, for example. I've worked for Call of Cthulhu. I've worked for loads of games. I do stuff. I've also done lots of 40k bits and bobs through my time as well, because who doesn't love a bit of 40k?
Yeah.
So, loosely speaking, that's who I am. I also am now an RPG chappie. I run my own company, Rookery Publications, co-owning it with a bunch of other super cool folks. And we produce system generic stuff. All the people that we worked with there were people that I worked with on Warhammer. So they're all Warhammer fans. Indeed, we're about to live stream with a bunch of them the Enemy Within campaign from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. And we're going to be live streaming that online like the idiots that we are. That's going to be an awful lot of fun.
I'm going to be watching the absolute hell out of that. And if y'all haven't, I will have links kind of around when this is posted up on YouTube and such for all of the Rookery stuff, especially. If you haven't, you should check it out. I've been binging some of those podcasts lately, and they are excellent and also hysterical. So I highly recommend them.
About that. Yeah, just add a bit about that. We stream every single week. We're between seasons just now, between season 4 and 5. I can't believe we've got 4 seasons up already. Well, it feels like I just started it like last week. But we've got 4 seasons worth of material with people from across the games industry. We speak to computer games people, we speak to board games people, we speak to role-playing games people, we speak to artists, we speak to producers. We take a deep dive into writing, world building, literally everything to do with gaming. And mostly it's just us getting together with our mates and having a really big laugh for an hour every single Saturday. It's a good time.
Yeah, and it's very delightful to watch. It's very engaging. The chat's able to ask questions, and yeah, highly recommend for anybody that has any interest, whether it's in video games or story writing or just anything. There's really no excuse not to watch it, to be frank, especially if you've somehow ended up here. With introductions out of the way, let's go ahead and just kind of dive into, Warhammer Fantasy, something very near and dear to my heart and this community's heart. Like, we've kind of very much built up around Warhammer Fantasy lore and literature. I know you saw that not too long ago, I did a video kind of, that's the first step into exploring the cosmology and the kind of like the stars and everything, Warhammer Fantasy, and there's this amazing quote from Fenrir, and it was like, oh, this is perfect. And I reached out to one of my voice actor friends and came in and did it, and it turned out perfect. And you literally wrote that, and it's
yeah, I wrote that.
it's wild to think that of like, I have to say it's so amazing and kind of terrifying to just kind of like be able to sit and talk with someone who it's like, I literally study the stuff that you've written for a job. Like that's what I do for a living. So I study this.
There's a small story on that one, actually. It was originally written, that particular piece, for the 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay back in about 2007. And I sat down, and we were doing the religion book for that game at that time, which was called The Tome of Salvation.
Right, excellent book.
I did a huge chunk of that book. And the cosmology was obviously an important part of that. I created all the star systems. I created, all the, not the star system, the zodiac. I built all the stars that they had for that. And I was working through the planets as well. That took a little bit of research because there was quite a lot of material that had been hidden away in little resources here or there. Black Library novels, for example. There's a mention in a comics and somewhere, and I'd collated all the sources, got it right, and I was like, it's done. I've got all the planets. I know where they are. I know how they got there. I've got the whole thing. Going to write a really cool thing for this. Wrote the cool thing for it. Did myself a very quick image, which you may have referenced in your video as well.
Yes,
which was the soul and all the planets.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was up. So I did that image as well, and I did that for the Tome of Salvation, and that was all sent off. And suddenly, right just before publication, Games Workshop went, I'm not sure if we want to clarify this or not. Do we want to clarify this or not? Do we want to have it written down so we're bound by it in a future publication? I'm not sure we do. And there was a loose conversation. I was like, well, it's out of my hands now. I've done my job. And off it went. And they eventually decided to cut that little box in the end. A tiny little box in the corner, which was going to have a very small map and just that little bit from Finrear saying the things about how many planets there were and all the rest of it. And the harmony of the spheres. So I was like, oh, well, that's a shame. And I just kept it on my computer. And it got dropped into deleted sections document at one point about the Tome of Salvation because I'd cut personally about 15,000 words from that book because there was only so much space that I had. And my submission for that was I did about 70,000 words of that book as I recall. So I cut about 10,000 of those, including a huge chunk about the dwarves and how they built the calendar that they had and how that influenced the imperial calendar. And that was super fun. But that was a wee while.
I don't suppose there's a secret place where any of these are lurking around.
I don't know. I mean, they might. I lost most of my older stuff from the mid-2000s in a hard drive crash, which was the saddest day because I must have lost about 1 million words, which was tears flowing down my cheeks.
Yeah, I bet I'm crying just thinking about it.
Plus around about, Warhammer maps alone, I must have lost around about 250, something like that, because I'd done so many, of those about 100 or so, or maybe 120 were published, but I had a whole bunch of other ones as well. Anyway, it came to 4th edition, and it was nearing the end of my tenure. I was just at the point of resigning from being the producer of the 4th edition of the game. So I was the person who did all the commissioning. I got everyone in, I discussed with them what they were going to write, I told them what they could and they couldn't do, that sort of thing. And I hired on all the artists, and we were just at the point where I was going, and I was doing the final passes on the calendar section for Enemy and Shadows, which was the first part of the Enemy Within campaign, the campaign I'm foolishly going to be streaming online like an idiot. And there was a space, and I went, there's a space, and I can pull that, because I know exactly what should go in there. So I pulled out my old Harmony of the Spheres doc, tried to find it, it wasn't there. Cried because it had been lost in the hard drive crash, had a good think, and then remembered that it got posted online somewhere, did a bunch of web searches, found parts of it, constructed my old article that I wrote from those parts, and then found out a friend of mine had copied everything I posted into one of my old forums into a file. He posted it back to me. I had my original, popped that in, did a quick edit of it to make it make sense, and the Harmony of the Spheres is in Enemy and Shadows in the calendar section in the appendix. We got it out in the end, and Games Workshop were more than happy with it on the second pass through. They were like, yeah, that's totally cool. We've been dealing with this for quite some time now. All the stuff that you wrote the first time is now pretty much the thing. Away you go. Yeah. So there you go. That's how it goes.
And I'm so glad that it is there. Because it sets up, like, I never in my life thought that I was going to read a passage that maybe would go, wait, where's my Burning Shore book? Because I was like, where? Like, never thought I'd need to dig that book out of my shelf. But so, oh man, there's so many things that open. So just thinking about where to start. So I guess the best place to start is as someone who is like responsible for creating so much of the stuff that there's, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people like really combing nitty gritty stuff, trying to do all this world building. How do you approach, like, whether it's the Tome of Salvation or the Realm of the Ice Queen or Tome of Corruption or any of these books, where they're like, okay, here's a little army book that has some vague maps and just, some really, really broad details. And you look at that and go, okay, I need to create a culture and a calendar and a history, and it all has to kind of weave together this stuff that like 30 different people have worked on, and they didn't necessarily cross-check each other's stuff. They were just kind of...
They did not.
Yeah. So they're just, they're just kind of throwing things out that sound cool. And you're like, okay, I got to bring everybody together and also fill in like original stuff. Like so I guess Realms of the Ice Queen would be the best place to start. Of Kislev, very, very faintly covered. Not a lot before that. And you come in and create this, frankly, like practically a masterpiece of this thing that takes all these different like Eastern European cultures and a lot of very interesting mythologies and like some really famous mythologies like Baba Yaga and like these ideas of like, witches and hags, but also like the old mythology of the Ice Queen from that old fable. How do you take all of that and then compress it into something that looks like it makes sense?
Right. So this is pretty much my bread and butter. This is what I do and I have done for some time. And it's all spawned from when I used to work as staff at Games Workshop a long time ago, back when you were almost born, and I'm now feeling really old. And we would discuss how, for example, the Empire Army List, when it came out, the very first one, 1992, as I think we mentioned pre-call,
right.
It rewrote the Empire. Before the Empire Army List, you had what was presented in the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and it had a very detailed version of what the Empire was. And Karl Franz, for example, the good old Emperor, was not our griffin-riding hero at that point. He was almost certainly a decrepit, rather broken individual. Not necessarily that old, but most certainly not a very good emperor by any measure. And through the course of the Enemy Within campaign, likely died. In fact, almost certainly did die and was replaced. So most people at that time were very much of the opinion that Karl Franz was already the past, was already someone they were moving on from. And then the book comes out and says, Karl Franz wields the Hammer of Sigmar on a griffin and kicks ass, chews gums and takes names.
Yeah.
And that completely rewrote him. And completely rewrote the politics of the Empire as well by taking a look at the existing maps and simplifying it a little to smooth it down and make it a far easier presentation for the army list. And immediately you had camps beginning to form. Some people who said, well, this was nonsense. The old ways were better. Other people who said, well, we can make this all work together, can't we, somehow? And I was always in that camp. There is no reason that all of these versions of Warhammer can't be all speaking to the same thing.
Right.
They can all live inside the same universe with a little bit of thought. There is no reason that we can't make the Enemy Within marry well with what Warhammer presents. And from the beginning, that's what I did. When it comes to actually writing it, far later now, we're talking 25 years later, say on the end, 25? No, 15 years later for Realm of the Ice Queen. No, yeah, 15.
Yes.
For Realm of the Ice Queen. That is an exercise of that sort of mindset, it can all work together, put into practice with a bunch of creative people who then fill in all the gaps to make it all make sense. I was part of a team in that particular book. One of the members of that team, for example, was Graham McNeil. Graham McNeil had written the Ambassador Chronicles. You may have read the Ambassador Chronicles. They're a set of Black Library novels that take place in Kislev and deal with not Sean Connery. Honestly, he's not Sean Connery, but they deal with Sean Connery, the ambassador, Von Velten. And Von Velten is a great character. And through the course of that character's, let's say, passage through Kislev, you learn all manner of new stuff about Kislev. But we also had the army list for Kislev, which had come out for, I forget which edition it was at that point. We're probably looking at 6, 7.
I believe it was 6.
Somewhere around there. The Kislev, I think it was 6 it came out for, and that was written by Gav Thorpe. And Gav's version was, again, a bit different. And we had a slightly different version. We had a bunch of new gods added, where, for example, Graham McNeil, when he'd written the Ambassador Chronicles, he'd fallen back on the standard old world gods of Mor and Shalia, and hadn't really gone into any depth with any form of actual Kislev gods, our Ursins or our Tyre or whomever. And They had to be married together. But we also had the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 version of the Kislev. And if you've ever read Something Rotten in Kislev, it's very different. And I mean really different. Far more steeped in old Russian lore, with lots of spirits and higgledy-piggledy stuff. Far less Mother Kislev and the great open oblasts. And it's a massive taiga filled with trees in Fantasy Roleplay 1, where in Fantasy Roleplay 2, it changed completely into a wide open area of open oblast with snow everywhere. With Mother Kislev herself freezing the entire place and making it, even though it's on a similar level to many parts of the Empire, frozen to its core. And coming up with reasons for why that was the case and explaining everything became a part of the creative process. Because you've got to look at what Games Workshop had made and make it make sense within the world of the Empire. And the Empire, Talabikland, at one point used to stretch over Kislev. What does that mean?
Right.
At one point, Ostland used to stretch over that area. There used to be problems with the Ropsmans, with the local Ungol tribes. Exactly what did that mean as we try to figure out the past. And whenever you do a role-playing book, it requires so much more depth than is required for the wargame book, which is generally all it needs is enough detail to go, well, this is fucking cool. Right. I must pick those models now. I must collect them. So awesome. Where when you're doing the role-playing game, you've got a GM who wants to understand that world back to front, a games master who has to present it to other people. And they can't present something they don't understand. So you've got to go into more depth. Right. And sometimes that you've got to be careful. What depth? You don't want to add too much. You've got to leave the GM enough space to add whatever they want into their world. But you've certainly got to be a strong framework, a skeleton. And we had to make sense of several different versions. Plus, we even had things like an ice wizard that popped up in the old computer games in Dark Omen, I think it was. We had a nice wizard in there. And he was a nice wizard. He was a shaman, a nice shaman, as I recall. That's running really far back here. And we had a discussion right at the very beginning whether we were going to make the Ice Witches an all-female cast or whether it was going to be a mixture of men and women and how that was going to be done. And I did all the witch and the hag and material for the book and all the rules and all the careers and everything. So I landed very strongly on if we're going for something that's far closer to the realms of chaos, we need to start building different stories. And it was an attempt to start undermining what had been at that point the extraordinary male dominance of previous Games Workshop material. Where most of it was written by men for boys, as it was described at the time. Right. Or often by boys for boys. And they just didn't think outside of their box. They were very much inside their box, just going, and he does this, and he does that, cool! And he does this, and he does that, cool! And we already had the Ice Queen in place, as put in place by the Empire Army List in 4th edition for Warhammer. That was the book released in 1992, as we discussed earlier. Mm-hmm. And the Ice Queen of Kislev was put very firmly there. There's Katerin. So we had an establishment already. So we ran with what was already there, taking on lots of influences from around that. And slowly but surely pegged down how magic worked there, pegged down how the terrain worked, pegged down what Kislev was, pegged down everything, the religion, the rest, and then just, as I know, as ridiculous as this might sound, then we just wrote it. So I'll say loosely, there's one other big difference between someone like myself writing it and someone who's coming in blank. I was brought in as the lore guy on most of the books that I was doing, even books that I wasn't writing in during 2nd edition, for example. Uh-huh. I was drafted in to do last-minute drafts and edits on because I was doing most of the mapping as well. And the reason for that is because I'd read every Black Library novel. I owned them all. I'd read every army list. I played every computer game. Mm-hmm. I had every single Games Workshop game. I had over 10,000 points of every army that had been produced for Warhammer. I was that geek. 100% that geek. When I was 18, by the time I turned 18 and applied for Workshop for the first time, I already owned my own store that was selling Games Workshop models. I had every army in the game at that point. Mm-hmm. I said 10,000 points worth. And I was a bit of a fan. So I was drafted in as the person who would say, well, if we're writing Kislev, make sure we mention the Ambassador Chronicles, make sure we do, there's the Erengrad book, Jewel of Erengrad, whatever it's called, forget. And make sure that's mentioned, make sure the army list is included, make sure we include the 1st edition parts, make sure the Crags of Shargan are added. That was mentioned all the way back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, 2, all the way, not Fantasy Roleplay, pardon me, Warhammer. the big crags of Shargan, they were not mentioned anywhere else. Make sure we include Dan Abnett's book, Riders of the Dead. We've got to ensure that we include the rotas from that. We've got to ensure that the version of the Winged Lancers that we present match what's there, that the version of the Ungauls and the Gospodars match that too, because we want to try and make sure that all the different sources, if you read them, work with the book that we make. And that's an exercise in sometimes futility, because sometimes they massively contradict. As you mentioned earlier, there have been multiple writers, many of which haven't had access to all of the other sources when they put their piece together. And you also have different mediums, I suppose. Computer games have a completely different requirement to role-playing games, which have a different requirement to war games. So if you take, say, Mark of Chaos, that was one of the computer games that was brought out, it reshaped and rebuilt parts of Talabheim as required for their conclusion. And Talabheim and Talabheim, the entire north of it, just changed. And the question is, when you go to dealing with that section, do you include that or do you not? Because they just basically stuck in a spade and started digging as required for their game. Do you include that or do you not? And generally, my opinion is always, if you can, you do. If you can make it work, you try. You try not to contradict all those other sources, because you're always going to end up upsetting someone. And if you are making a change, you always do it for a reason. And I would always, my personal preference be, always do it from a position of intelligence and authority where you've already read all the sources, rather than just doing it because a new idea has struck you that you must have. And they're great. My personal preference in terms of gathering a team together for writing on a book like that, for example, is to have a nice mixture of folks. Someone who doesn't know the background particularly well but loves it. Someone who knows it really well. Someone who has a strong opinion. Because you get them all together and you have somebody at the top of it who makes the decisions. You end up with a really good team. Because someone who's really imaginative and might have ideas that no one else would have because they're so constrained within the boxes of Warhammer already. And they think, well, we can't do that. They are often the ones who will bring the best ideas to the table, the coolest new shit that you just look at and go, holy crap, we never considered adding that, but that totally makes sense with how we've built ice magic. Why did we do that? And everyone else who is very used to what ice magic is goes, well, I never thought about ice magic being like that, because I've always thought about it how it was presented before. So yeah, nice collaborative teams, lots of thought, and just writing that shit.
Yeah, well, so I have to point out a comment. So someone in my chat goes, "Oh man, Andy Law's like Sotek but older." I wish my life story started like that. Like, you know, I'm on the other side of the planet. I didn't get into Warhammer until granted, I was very young when I started it, but I wish that's how my story began. I do my best. But
marvelous.
So okay, so there's a lot of amazing details in that, and it kind of reflects a lot of things I've heard from some other writers I've had the privilege to speak with. Like, I know Andy Hall's talked a lot about kind of that open door policy Games Workshop really likes to use, of like, okay, if you're gonna write something cool, don't necessarily nitty gritty define every single little thing, like leave little smidges so that future people can come in, and if they read it, they could go, well, okay, like he talked about, they kind of mentioned this, let's nudge that open and see where it takes us. And, you know, I love what you said about ice magic, and that when Total War Warhammer 3 got announced, I remember one of the first things that I learned about early when I was helping out with little things with it was, you know, they were like, okay, so instead of just the lore of ice magic, we're going to have the lore of the Tempest. Because what if it was ice in the air? What about ice storms? And it's like, oh, yeah, that is really cool. That makes a lot of sense. Like, you know, it's like, because if we just do the lore of ice, because of the way the game's designed, we can only fit in 6 spells. But if we do a side lore, now we've got 12. But it's so interesting to kind of hear about, like, so it's, you know, it's kind of like all these foundational pillars and then working to connect those pillars with these bridges through writing that is so good. Like, I cannot write to save my life, but the writing in these books is so amazing, even though it's British writing. So oftentimes I have to pull up a dictionary and go, I don't know what this word is. I gotta look it up. British.
literally had, just as a small aside on that one, literally had my daughter complaining about that just the other day, because I speak in, as you put it, British, and my daughter similarly has a somewhat, let's say, broad vocabulary. And she was getting stick from her friends for saying words that they were like, what does this even mean? What are you saying? Just simple things. But for me, it was super simple. Like just simply, I'm famished rather than just I'm hungry. But yeah, she's a bit of a walking thesaurus. And in turn, I'm the same.
I will tell you, my parents have lovingly complained to me that I read too many British fantasy novels because I will use different words and they go, what? And I go, oh, it's just this. And they're like, well, why can't you just say that then? It's like, but this expresses it better.
So it absolutely does. Words have got meaning, and they also have. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of wordsmithing.
No, it's great. It makes the world feel more authentic and like much more. I don't know, like it's good when something forces you to learn something you didn't already know before. But
totally true.
And you know that kind of leads into one of the things that I love so much about Warhammer and the writing and creating y'all have done over the years when it comes to the world building elements. Is this whole thing of I've thanks to like Total War and just what I do on the internet and stuff, I've had the opportunity to travel and meet like Warhammer fans and talk with Warhammer fans like all over the world from lots of different places. And one of the things that always blows my mind, especially being from like, you know, I'm from Texas, doesn't really have an equivalent, you know, in the Warhammer world, which takes place, you know, a little further before you'd get your Texas in there, other than like maybe the old school centaurs, but they're almost more like kind of a Native American theming. But you know, I meet so many people who they fall in love with Warhammer because they're from somewhere that's maybe not as well known, or it has a lot of history, but it doesn't tend to appear in a lot of these like Lord of the Rings or like all this other stuff. And then they're watching Warhammer and they go, that's where I'm from. Like that's my culture represented. And they get so excited seeing these people they know or these mythologies that they've grown up with coming to life. And one of the things I've always wondered is when you're approaching a culture, so whether it's like how you have kind of Araby with a lot of kind of Middle Eastern themes, or Grand Cathay being very similar to China, and, you know, everybody talks about like, you know, the Holy Roman Empire with the Empire and all this stuff, Bretonia with like France and Arthurian legend kind of slapped together, Dark Elves with, I don't know, Americans, perhaps.
There are a little bit more Melnibonians from Michael.
There you go.
Yeah, quite.
What is the, like, how, one of the things I've always wondered is how do you take like either like a famous fable or like kind of an empire at its height from our world's history or mythology from our history and Warhammer-ify it? Like, what is that transformation that gets it from point A to point B? Yeah,
this is something that I've discussed quite a lot as well, because obviously we stream as well weekly, and we've had quite a few Warhammer writers on as well. And everybody seems to have a slightly different way of tackling it. Some tackle it very sensitively, some don't really think too much about it, and they just dive in and make it cool. Personally, I'm very, very aware of my whiteness, maleness, and my creeping age, and I'm fully aware that for all I might have a very strong voice or idea, that often, particularly if you're dealing with what is somebody else's culture, you require not just assistance in terms of sensitivity reading, but proper assistance in terms of how to present it in general.
Right.
I don't find that it's particularly hard, because I'm naturally creative and I really enjoy playing with these things. And nowadays, I would argue it's harder than it used to be. And by that, I mean, you're far more aware of the fact that you're probably making mistakes than you might have been maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. And very much more aware than, say, Games Workshop were in the 80s when they lapsed into unconscious racism frequently.
Right. And
that's the sort of material that often when I come in at a far later date, say I'm coming in writing the early noughties, for example, and I'm looking back and I've been requested to say, do Kislev. And you look at it and you go, well, they've taken somebody else's culture and they've done this with it and they've done that with it. That's great. But if you went to, say, Araby or the Southlands, or if you went to Nippon, often the older Games Workshop material just was not great. It wasn't created with a great deal of thought. And one of the great joys of being able to re-examine material like that is to bring it up to date, is to make it awesome and cool. There are still sensitivities. For example, I know some people who still don't like, say, for example, the Lands of the Dead or Lizardmen, because they've taken somebody else's culture and they've completely rejigged it, and basically said, basically, it's that culture, all those people who live there, but they're Lizardmen now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And they turn them into effectively monsters. And for some people, that's really difficult. For others, they love it because they can go, this is a culture that I'm from. I totally understand. This is awesome.
Right.
And as creators, there's a fine line to walk. And I think that is worth being very open about right from the outset. And that's that if you are dealing with something that is loosely based on someone else's culture, there are sensitivities at hand that you must be aware of when you come towards the actual creation of this new set of material. But when you get stuck in, the actual process of Warhammerifying it is often a process of taking all the bits that people find cool and building on it, taking all the bits that that are culturally different and fascinating and exciting and building on those, not being beholden to the real world because it isn't. And there's a lot of people, particularly in the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay side of things, who attach themselves to certain historical realities and assume that the Warhammer world will be the same. A classic example of that is the most famous of all its settings, the Empire, where often it's not just equated to the Holy Roman Empire. People sort of port bits over and say, well, if it's like this in the Holy Roman Empire, it should be like that in Warhammer. But it really isn't.
Right.
Because Warhammer is so massively different. Whether it's the forests that are full with giant spiders and beastmen and dragons and who knows what else, it's just not safe out there. It's a completely different realm with a completely different history and a completely different outset. It's had gunpowder for, depending upon which version of the lore you look at, 1,000 years. And technologically hasn't shifted very much from that. The answers as to why are super fascinating. And that's something that the roleplay game is deeply interested in, where things like, say, a battle game aren't. Because they just want to know is, does it have guns?
Yeah.
I look at the Lustria book. The Lustria book says in 1492 they had guns and cannons. Interesting. How do they look different to the ones in... Well, they're the same as the ones that they have 1,000 years later. Interesting!
Right.
But it doesn't... the role-playing game worries itself about making sense of those details. Novels might make sense of those details if that's where the focus is. But your battle game just doesn't care at all. It's far more concerned with the cool. What's big and awesome about it. And as slightly depressing as this may sound, it's just, what's the cool? Yeah, let's add that. Can't help it when you're doing Warhammer.
Right.
Yeah, it's sort of like the real world, sort of in places, but it's dialed up to 11 and completely different. And I tend to find that every single time that we've been building something for the Warhammer world, that the best stuff comes from a collaboration of people. For example, I work very closely and often with Mark Gibbons. You may know Mark Gibbons. He's an artist that worked for Games Workshop in their studio all the way through the 90s and has continued to do work for them.
Saw a very big thread conversation about his art literally yesterday. People just loving on it.
Mark is astonishingly good. And what he's astonishingly good at is taking an idea and reimagining it to be super cool. So, for example, he did much of what people recognize as the modern day Black Templars. Him and Graham McNeil beavered away at those and turned them into what they are today. And that was super cool. But I work with him pretty much daily. And I come up with an idea that I might have written. I'll call it Bob. I come up with idea Bob, and he comes back and he says, well, you made mention that Bob does this, 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 and the only way that Bob can be realized is if this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And it's the collaboration between creatives that come up with stuff that neither of us would individually have created. Because he wouldn't have built the thing that I wrote. I would never have imagined it the way he imagined it. And the larger the teams of passionate creatives, the more awesome the end results are. And the broader the team as well in terms of their cultural backgrounds, the more you're going to get awesome ideas getting fed into it. If we all happen to be middle-aged white guys, we're going to get a middle-aged white guy fantasy.
Right.
And it might be an awesome middle-aged white guy fantasy, but it's ultimately going to be a very middle-aged white guy fantasy.
Right.
But if you've got a mixture of different genders, a mixture of different backgrounds, all pulling together with really awesome ideas, suddenly cool characters emerge from it that none of you would have made. And you just sit back and go, well, holy fuck, fantastic. That's amazing. Yeah. And then it gets resolved in the end. And that's, for me, been my experience with creating Warhammer in general. Getting really good people together, talking out really cool ideas, and then nailing them down into the very best versions of what they are.
And I love that answer so much. And just this idea of like, God, I love that so much. One of the, I still remember one of the things that really like shocks me in a good way is, when I was getting really into Age of Sigmar and I was like collecting all the notes, because there was a small time where I was like, I don't want to, the end times happened and all this stuff. And when it first started, it was it was all very kind of, there were a lot of hurt feelings and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. But, I started really getting into it around the end of first edition, started second edition, and was kind of collecting all those Black Library novels. And they released a Daughters of Cain book that was from 3 new authors for Black Library who were all women, writing about these dark elves, or the Daughters of Cain. And it was amazing. Like, it was such a different take on, like, each of the stories were different, but they were all also interwoven into one overall narrative. It was stupid how good that story was, and was such an exciting take that it was still witch elves, but it was a way more like dynamic, and it was just like, God damn, this is really fun writing. They're on the Reddit, one of the most easily probably right now a lot of the Total War fans are feverishly foaming at the mouth over these large areas we have on the map that are covered in fog of war and you can't go into. And everyone's like, let us in. And there's there's this group of writers and artists who are from a collection of different nations in Southeast Asia who have been doing their own fan project on how do they envision Koresh. And it's amazing. Like, they've been writing their own lore, they do their own art, and the creatures they create are nightmarish, but also they're fascinating. And learning like the creatures that they have in their own mythology of like, man, y'all had some scary stuff to be scared of over there, apparently. But it's so much better than anything that I think anyone from over in the West would have thought of on their own, of like, oh, Snakemen, okay. And they're over there go, well, what if instead of just Snakemen, we had like these like horrific, like large creatures that use like all these really weird physical technologies to create these monsters that have like these bizarre internal structures showing, or like they're missing, like their head isn't attached, and so they've got like this weird other system, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. And we never would have thought of that. It's beautiful.
I don't just agree. I strongly support that as a general creative outlet, largely because I'll give an example. I work quite a bit with Graham Davis. Now, depending upon your Warhammer lore, Graham Davis created much of what we understand to be the modern day Warhammer, all the way back from first edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. He was eventually the chap who produced that entire line. And he created Shadows over Bergenhafen, for example, a very famous adventure for that game. And he created much of what the modern empire is. And we were discussing one of his books that he had built regarding Scandinavia and various other places. And his book was largely built from research, because that's what you do. And his was particularly detailed in the areas that he himself had grown up with, because it not only fascinated him, he grew up with it, he knew it. And as we were discussing it, I dropped in some details from where I'm from. Now, I'm from the very north of Scotland. You can't go much further north without swimming. In fact, you can't. I lived in a lighthouse up there in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, pretty much. If you had a telescope that could see around bends, you would see Iceland and then just pure ice from where I used to live. But no, it's just empty water. And up there's all manner of Viking artifacts and stories and old ghost stories, none of which are recorded in books. And these are the things I grew up with.
Right.
And those were the details that his book was missing, because he'd not heard of any of those. I gave some alternative spellings for things, different ways things could be expressed. And he was like, oh, that's all really good. Some of the stuff is stuff I could have used for this, that, and the other. And we talked that out, and it was awesome. But it just reaffirmed to both of us how important it was to get people from the areas that you are discussing to be involved with the project. So if you are, for example, creating a Lizardman book, you don't just do it with old white dudes. You get people who have lived there, grown up with similar cultures, who have got stories that are redolent with detail that you might never have thought of, because all you're doing is book learning and repeating, regurgitating, and twisting, where they're coming at it and going, there's this cool thing I grew up with, and there's this other thing, and my friend has told me this, and couldn't we pull that in? And you're just left going, this sounds fucking ace. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's that color that you will not otherwise get if you're doing it purely from a book learning perspective. So yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Bring in the teams and make them really cool and broad.
Yeah, and it's that perfect thing of like, if you go back and look at old school Lizardmen, it's a lot of puns, and that kind of seems to be kind of like the hardest thing to push. They're like, yeah, we got teeny weeny. We got Itsy Bitsy, we got Lord Chili Pepper, like we're going hard here. And you're like, ooh. But like, you look at the new Lustria book that just came out, and it's just dripping with all this amazing stuff. And like, I'm chilling I hired a GM that I've learned about who's a very prolific GM, and he's from Peru. And I was like, hey, would you mind running like a Lustria campaign for us? And he's like, yeah. He's like, you mind if I take like kind of my own Peruvian heritage and stuff and kind of mix things in? He's like, please do. Yeah. Those are going to be on Thursdays for anyone in chat that wants to watch those. We will live stream them. But yes, it's so like super excited to get into that, of like not only really embracing, because as being a like Lizardman, Loremaster, Sotek, Lizardman were kind of my bread and butter growing up, and I've had these really beautiful letters sent to me, and messages from people in Peru and Argentina and Brazil and all these countries who say, hey, like, we love your work. And like, just being able to see like expressions of Nahuatl or Peruvian or like all these different cultures expressed. Like, yeah, sure, they're dinosaur guys, but they're really fucking badass dinosaur guys with laser beams and all this stuff. And they're they're like, we're the good guys. Like, sure, we're spooky, but like, we're the custodians of the planet and kicking Chaos's ass around the globe. And it's like, man, and they're just these beautiful messages. We don't get to be in anything. Like people, either they learn about us or they never hear about it. But because of the Lizardmen, it's like, oh, this is so popular. Why don't we have more of these kinds of designs in other fantasy universes? Or just even historically, I know a lot of people who get into Warhammer and then they end up becoming very big historians. Like they end up going into archaeology or other historical careers, which I don't know if you guys that have written all this know how much y'all have inspired like literally an entire generation after y'all to go into all of these like historical based careers or writing careers, because they read these things that are like, I want to go find that shit.
It's funny, most of us come from that sort of background, whether it's writing or history. Graham Davis, who I mentioned before, he came from an archaeological background. Me and Andy, who do a lot of writing here, we both studied English. But yeah, it's what we do.
and yeah, we're so glad you do it. So getting back towards actual Warhammer lore stuff, and so one of the things that I was the most amazed about, I will never forget when I got my hands on Warhammer 4th edition roleplay for the first time, because I was so confused right at the start. Because I opened the book, I was so excited, I opened it, I started reading the Empire lore, and I was like, what is this? Like, I don't recognize, like, there's all these provinces I don't know, and there's all these elector counts I don't know. What is going on here? And I remember I had a friend who was like, so what'd you think of the book? And I was like, I mean, I liked it, but like, I don't understand, like, this isn't the Empire I know. This is this weird Empire I've never heard about. And I was like, I'll kind of put it off to the side and come back to it later. And then like, I carried on playing 2nd edition for a while. And then the Enemy Within series started coming out. And a friend of mine was like, hey man, did you read about this like really cool development that happened in this book about, and like, oh, I saw Mary's Leetdorf show up. And I'm like, whoa. And so I started buying all these books and reading and seeing how it's all of a sudden this bridge connecting the old lore to the more modern lore, and it was like, holy fuck, like, Jesus. It literally went out. Yeah,
that was the plan.
It literally went about all of it that day. Like, don't want to talk about how much money I spent, but just bought the whole thing. So I have to, how was the process of looking at, okay, we've got this old Enemy Within story that we really want to bring forward, and then we've got this endpoint. Let's, like, right. Was that difficult?
Yes, and it was So this was my goal right from the outset. When I was very first contacted about the 4th edition of Warhammer, it hadn't been written, it wasn't anywhere. They were halfway through developing a system. And they contacted me because I had been highlighted to them as someone that had been the deep lore guy in the 2nd edition, and I was known to a few of them. They contacted and said, "Hi, we're doing this. Have you got any recommendations as to what you would do if you were building a 4th edition of the game? And by the way, we intend to release the Enemy Within." So my very first response was, well, if you're doing that, the Enemy Within is enormously different to the Warhammer that was presented. Let's go hark back to the earlier discussion from before, the 1992 Empire Army List, which rewrote the Empire from the 1st edition. We have a unique opportunity here where you could make all the same setting. As I say, it's always been my goal to try and take all of those disparate sources and make sense of them. So why don't you, if you're in a position now where you're redoing the Enemy Within, instead of just rewriting it and making it fit the 8th edition version of the background from Warhammer, why not leave it with the 1st edition of Warhammer and have the events of the Enemy Within create 8th edition? So you can use that campaign to go from one version of the Empire into a completely new version of the Empire. Because we know that it's a constantly shifting set of provinces and city-states and grand provinces, and they all work in a variety of different ways. It will make the setting feel more dynamic. It will make everything feel like a more real place rather than 1,000 years worth of gunpowder. This will feel like it's something that's constantly shifting and moving, and you can tell a really cool story with that. Mm-hmm. And they were like, yeah, that sounds freaking awesome. Yeah, let's go away and think about that. So they went away. I gave them a whole bunch of other stuff about how I organize the rules as well, because I'm also Games Insider. And that all went down.
Is there anything you don't do?
No. There's a reason I'm a hat with an entire rainbow on it, beyond just good old pride reasons. I will wear every hat, and I'm happy with almost any job. I've done everything from sales to direct sales to writing to art to cartography.
Yeah, see, chat, this is what I want to be when I grow up. I don't think I'm ever going to get there, but this is...
For example, in 2nd edition, I'm credited as a developer of one of the books. I'm a proofreader on a few books. I'm an artist on some of the books. I'm a cartographer on about 3/4 of the books. I'm a writer on about 5 or 6 of the books. I've literally done every job you can do in there. So that's why they contacted me for the 4th edition. They contacted again about 2 months after that. They hadn't made a great deal of progress in terms of the system or where they were, and at that point they were far more of a, you have all of these ideas, how do we best incorporate them, can you nail that down? In the end, they hired me to do it. So I sat down and I nailed it all out, and it's not long after the rulebook was completed, I was employed to just run the line, and I got in contact with Graham Davis, whom I mentioned before. Graham Davis is doing the, let's say, special edition of the Enemy Within. And we had a big discussion. Every week we would be chatting about what we could do with it. And when he was brought on to just basically update it for whatever the new edition of the game was. And that was it. Okay. That was it. So it was going to be the original Enemy Within, with the original Enemy Within city-states, with 2 different books at the end that he was going to write. One of which was going to be the Horned Rat, the second of which we hadn't even named at that point. The reason we chose the Horned Rat is because the Horned Rat as a book was originally advertised in White Dwarf way back. We're talking back when the very first edition Realms of Chaos books hadn't yet been released. So far back that they hadn't even reached 3 numbers for White Dwarf numbers at that point. They were in still double digits, and they're saying the Horned Rat is coming soon. It never came. Right. It is by far the book that has had the longest running advert before eventually it was released. All the way back from like the late 80s all the way up to 2000 and whatever it was, 20 or something it was released on. Super fun. So I sat down with Graham and I said, look, Graham, I've got this idea. Why don't we go much further than you intended and create a Warhammer Enemy Within for everybody? Not just for the 1st edition fans who will dwell in their nostalgia, but for Warhammer 8 fans as well, who will look at it and see the end of it and go, what's my empire? Awesome! People who sat in between and weren't really sure. Newbies who come along will have no idea that it's different between the 2, so it'll be cool for them too. So we'll be able to get new people, old people of different stripes and pull them all together underneath one, hopefully, banner setting that is Warhammer. And Graham was like, that's perfect. I've always wanted to do that. That's great. I was never happy with how things were rewritten and changed because he watched all of his material become something completely new. Because he wrote the empire as it was before, the one that was presented in the book that you went, I'm not sure what empire that is. That's the empire Graham created. And he was like, I've never been happy with the fact they rewrote it. Not that I didn't think it was cool, it's just that it felt like they were overwriting my work, but instead this will incorporate my work. This will make it all one part of a seamless whole. This is great! And we really enjoyed nailing it all down into place. And effectively creating a plot that by the end of the Enemy Within, if you played it and the PCs went down the most obvious routes, that the Empire at the end of it would be the same as Warhammer 8. I pitched that to Games Workshop after I finished pitching it to Graham. Graham was 100% behind it. There wasn't even the slightest hesitation. He was like, this is the best. I then pitched it to Games Workshop and I said, look, this is what you've been pitched already, which was the original Enemy Within, but for the new edition of the game. I don't think that's sufficient. I think it needs to incorporate everything and make Warhammer 8 so that by the end of that particular run of books, it is exactly pairing up in line with the most recent edition of Warhammer. And I got, unsurprisingly, enormous thumbs up from Games Workshop.
Right.
They were like, oh yeah. And we emailed back and forth a little bit about how best to nail that into practice. They had some ideas, I had some ideas. It was all super exciting. So what ended up being the case was that Graham did the initial treatments and then I updated it so it did all the bridging work.
Okay.
So he started building all the struts and then I built the bridge, so to speak. And that was my job. His job was to make sure the adventure in place. My job was to make sure that the adventure worked, added in extra detail, ensure that there was space for things like not just Marius Lightdorf, but in the first drafts we also had characters from Fat Shark's game, from Vermintide, popping in. Fat Shark are the best people in the world, by the way. When we were building the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set, I was talking to them all the time, because the starter set for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is set in Ubersreich. It's set in Ubersreich 10 years before the Skaven invade.
I cannot tell you, when I first got my hands on that and I opened, I was like, hey, that's the Red Moon Inn. Hey, that's what's like. It's like all these characters are popping up. It's like, oh, this is sick.
Yeah, it was super fun. And in the starter set, there's a half-page illustration beside the Rat Catchers Guild, and the 4 people in that are 4 staff members from Fat Shark.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I wrote them in as the Guildmaster, and it's their actual names. The Guildmaster, because they've all got super Warhammer names, they're just the best. The Guildmaster of the Rat Catchers and the various other Rat Catchers there, and they were all staff in Fat Shark because they had just been the best. I got sent over a developer set of code for Vermintide, which allowed me to fly, which was freaking awesome. So you'd obviously play the game and kill more rats than you could possibly imagine with whatever weapons you had to hand. But then I could just take off and fly up and go, right, so this is what their version of Ubersreich looks like. Interesting. But for our version of Ubersreich, we had to ensure that, much like I always did with everything with Warhammer, incorporated everything. Their version of Ubersreich had taken a lot from the 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Red Moon Inn, for example. And they'd added some extra details, but they'd missed out a couple of the details that were in 3rd edition, but they'd also missed out a couple of details that were elsewhere. So I thought it was important to ensure they were incorporated, so that's where Blackrock Castle came in and popped back up again. Enormous fortification off to the side of Ubersreich, which wasn't really a focus or a part of the Vermintide games, nor is it mentioned in any of their maps. But that's an example of making sure you include everything when you try to collate everything together. And generally speaking, the roleplay game is the best place to put it, because that means any other game that comes along and go, well, these are the bits that work for us, and take it. And so they miss bits out, whatever. There's so many different versions of Warhammer now. I don't think anyone minds that much. I mean, Warhammer, the Total War game, takes characters from across time almost and throws them down together.
Yeah, I can't tell how many times someone's like, so what's the canonicity of this game? It's like, let's be careful with that word. that's a dangerous word in these parts.
Is it a part of Games Workshop's canon? Yes. Yeah. As in the canon of work, the collected work that they have? Absolutely. Does it marry well with the rest of the work? Yeah. Yes, in some places, really well. Yeah. In others? Let's do a little dance.
You just blur the lines a little bit. It's fine.
Yeah, totally. They've got their own needs for their game, and they've chosen the best material for their game. And I don't just not begrudge them that. I applaud them for doing that, for having the creativity to go beyond the lines that were already set and defined by other writers, and realizing where those lines were useful to stay inside, and in other points where they were useful to transgress and change for the need of the game and the awesome experience they were building. Because each game has got its own requirements. And Warhammer is ultimately, and I barely, it's made up.
What? No.
I can't believe I'm saying this. But it's just all made up.
Listen,
so it's fine for some people to contradict it. Me, I can't, because of the way that my brain works. I'm like, I won't contradict. I will make it all work. But I don't just appreciate that other people can and will overwrite that. I hope they do, because often they come out with far cooler stuff. Again, Kislev is a fine example of that. Look at what the studio did. And then after the studio had done its first treatments, what Total War did with it, it's leagues beyond what was set up with Realm of the Ice Queen. But without Realm of the Ice Queen, it wouldn't have got there. Basically, everybody is standing on everybody else's shoulders and creating something cooler and more awesome with each new height. It's great.
Right. Well, and they do such a good job of, like, you could see there are connecting threads nowadays from people being like, okay, while we are inspired by this and we're ending up somewhere different, let's try and make it make sense. Where they didn't just come in and go, here's Tsar Boris and Katerin at the same time, don't worry about it. They're like, no, okay, there's a quest battle about how Tsar Boris did die, but he got frozen and Kislev kept him preserved, and he's actually secretly alive, and he's been in a Superman healing coma, don't worry about it, go break him out of the ice. And now you can play him. Great, he's awesome. And he realizes going home would be bad for politics, so he's gonna just go kick chaos around for a while.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. And there's all this amazing stuff of, like, the Great Orthodoxy makes sense. Like, did it exist in Realm of the Ice Queen? No, but it is a sensible development on Boris being like, okay, Kislev has been in a really crappy state since the Great War, and chaos keeps infiltrating us through these really weird little rituals we have with all our gods. They keep pretending to be our gods, so I'm going to make a formalized religion. But then he dies, and now Kostaltin's taken over, and Kostaltin's a little odd. He's a little more power hungry, and it's like, it just works. It works really well, and like it's like, if they explore that going forward, is it going to be the exact same as Total War portrayed it? Well, probably not, because Total War is like trying to make sure, how can we make it where these factions can declare war on each other, and it kind of makes sense.
It's broad brushstrokes,
right?
They're not drilling into the tiny detail with a tiny little detail brush with Citadel written on it. What they're using is a big, huge spray and spraying out the primary colors. When you stand back, you go, "That's fucking Warhammer." But when you get close, you realize there's lots of spray marks, and the roleplay game tends to come in and go, "How can we add all the detail here? How can we put some flecks in the eyes and make the eyes really shine? What can we do here to make sense of this big, huge, what appears to be a cloak, but it's just a big purple mass? We now need to turn this into something." And then the detail is added, because the roleplay, they're big books, and they're filled with fun details that games masters can use. And yeah, each game has got its own need and its own restrictions, because games like Total War are completely restricted by not only the gameplay, but what the tech can actually manage to do.
Right.
And what their level designs allow, and what they need for that game. And they'll create stories to make sense of not just the need for the character, for example, Tsar Boris, but the need for the tech. Okay, how many units can they get? Exactly what is going to be presented on the battlefield this day? What sort of backgrounds can we do? Are we going to have sieges? We're not going to have sieges. How are you going to get from this place to this place? What is it all going to look like? And do we have enough, let's say, time to put that all into place? If the answer is no, then clearly their buildings look like this. And they make decisions that are based on more than just the words, where on the role-playing side, 100% the words. Yeah, it defines everything, even the pictures to a degree, because often, particularly in the role-play game, the words come first and the art's commissioned after.
Okay.
That's not always the case with video games, where often concept art might come first.
Okay.
And then the words make sense of all the concept art, because it's so fucking cool. That allows the artist an enormous amount of freedom, because they can just look at all the cool stuff and go, "Hey, I want to draw that cool stuff." And then the writer comes in afterward and goes, "What the hell is that?" Well, it's big. we're going to have to figure out how this works. So it works differently in computer games and sometimes works differently for the studio as well. They often art first, write after. Where the role-playing game, it's write first, art after. So very different requirements in terms of what can and can't be done.
Yeah, and there, I've seen some really cool things about that, especially when it comes to the Total War Warhammer series. Like, you have situations like when they were making Grand Cathay, you have like, there's an artist that's like, okay, I know we've got like the terracotta army from history. What if I made a really big one? Like just a huge terracotta guy. And this is kind of what he looks like. And the writer walks in and is like, all right, I guess I can make this work. And they do. Like, it's like, oh, okay, these are like functioning pieces of the Great Bastion that have broken off to kill things. Very cool.
Crunch. Yeah, totally. Awesome.
So one of the things I wanted to ask about, because I hear, so my GM in my Sunday games, which is not a stream game, it's just a personal series. My GM for that is amazing. And he's definitely one of those individuals that like, he's in all the little forums and Discord threads and all the unofficial FAQs and all stuff. Because for anyone that doesn't know, there's a lot of the writers for all the different Cubicle 7 stuff have, yes, especially Mr. Law here.
I've done an enormous amount of FAQ.
Yeah,
I've got over 300 questions answered.
Yeah, answered so many questions. And one of the things y'all talk a lot about is like, oh, we had all these really cool things, but like, there's only so many pages, and there's some probably poor bastard whose job ultimately is be like, okay, I understand this is cool, but like, how do you navigate those waters of being like, okay, I'm going to give you 250 pages. I understand you have 1,000 pages worth of cool stuff, but you got to break it down to 250 pages.
Planning. That's it. It's planning. You've got a book, you know how many pages it's going to be approximately, you plan it out each section, you know exactly what you're going to put in it, then you commission someone to write it, and you tell them to write within that particular framework. Away they go, they do it. There may have been other things you might have wanted to include, but right from the outset, you know what you're going to do. I cannot recommend planning enough. I'm a constant planner, and there's a reason I'm a planner. It's because I like spiraling off into lots of different directions, dropping into cul-de-sacs of awesome. For example, the harmony of the spheres, and those are the bits that I will add after the books are written, when all the little spaces have popped up in the layout, and you're like, well, I've got a little half page I can fill with something awesome here. Excellent. And that's when those little extras are often spun up. And that was a part of my job as the overall producer. I would come in afterwards and fill up all these little gaps with things like the harmony of the spheres. Good times. But for all there is an absolute plethora of potential material that could be added, you can't. Particularly on a role-playing book, you've got a limit to how many pages that you've got a limit to your type size, how much art you're going to put in, whatever else it may be, and you plan it out from the outset. Having said that, I find Warhammer writing, to go back to an earlier question, how do you do it? Warhammer writing for me this is something we discuss a lot at this end, as in my end with the Rookery and the people I tend to work with here, particularly when it comes to Warhammer, because we're about to stream a Warhammer game. And hopefully you'll understand a bit more once we've streamed our game what I'm talking about here. For us, writing Warhammer, because 3 of the people that are going to be in the streamed game have written for the game, is not creating stuff. In some respects, it's remembering it. Because we've been playing Warhammer for about... When was it released?
I was about to say
that long.
Yeah, I was about to say, I can answer it. You're not going to like the answer though.
It's that long. Let's not use numbers here, because I'm a lot older than I like to admit. But when Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition came out, I bought it. The very first copy of the second edition that came out was released in Edinburgh, and I bought it. So I bought the very first retail copy. I bought pretty much every edition as it's come out, and I played it to death. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy the game so much, because I play them again and again and again and again. As have my players, as have some of the people who've written on the game. And for them, they don't go, right, what cool things are we going to put into Altdorf? What things can we do that really epitomizes Altdorf? Instead they go, well, we've got about 500 locations that we already know are in Altdorf, because we've lived in that city for the last 20 years. We know Altdorf. We know all of its politics. We know all of its guilds. We know all of its streets. We know its bridges, its islands. We know Altdorf. The question is, which ones do we not use? And it's a matter of whittling it down to the ones that best represent the politics, that best represent the overall picture of the city that you're presenting that day. Now, depending on your size of Altdorf will depend upon the sort of stories that you tell. Altdorf has, over the course of time with Games Workshop, been presented at multiple different sizes. First edition, it had a city that was 15,000 people. That's barely the size of some armies that modern Warhammer uses. We then moved to second edition, which had a city of 105,000 people. That's off the top of my head. I think I'm right with that. 105,000 people. But again, I remember discussing this with the studio when I went down. I said, look, we've got an Altdorf book coming up. I'm planning it out right now. How big do I go? Because Altdorf is, for Warhammer, their equivalent of Rome. It's their Constantinople. Mm-hmm. It is their big center of all population in their equivalent of an old world, an old Europe. They don't have Rome or Constantinople. It's a completely different framework, a completely different setup. The Empire is by far the most powerful nation in the old world. Mm-hmm. Significantly so. There's only one city that's definitely bigger, and that's Marienburg. How big do I make Altdorf? And they were like, well... And I was like, here's my pitch. And I laid out how big it had been in various novels. I laid out how big it had been for various games, and importantly, how big some of the armies had been. And we eventually landed on a city that was much like any of the biggest classical cities, about 1 million people. It's a proper enormous city.
Right.
And we said, right, that's probably how big Altdorf is, but that's so different to what we had before. Do we want to contradict it? Do we want to add hard numbers, or do we want to just use vague language? Huge city, center of population, you know, that sort of stuff. Mm. And by the time I left the production job, Games Workshop were very much of the opinion, no, it's freaking huge.
Right.
This is where freaking Karl Franz himself is doing his thing. And the city-state of Altdorf, the surrounding lands and Altdorf itself are enormous. And that's what we want to have represented. And I was like, yep, sounds great. And that's what I was writing to. And it's very much what my version of Altdorf in my head is.
Right.
Inevitably, though, as I move on, other writers move in and they've got different views. And that's always going to be the case whenever someone new comes on, much like Kislev was rewritten in a different way. Religion was re-examined. The sort of troops that they had were re-examined. And that's brilliant because new minds come in and add extra detail. There was a reason that I was going off in all this. What was it? Altdorf, it's big. There was a reason I was drilling down in Altdorf, though.
You know, my brain was already moving on to like, oh, I want to ask about this. So I
yeah, totally. Let's move on.
Maybe someone in chat will know. I'll keep an eye. Maybe one of them will be like, this is where y'all were going with that particular.
This is in fact, no. This is why I need a plan. That's why. And in fact, this epitomizes why I use plans, because my brain spirals off in new lines of thought, coming up with cool new stuff we could add, which means right at the outset, I can't say, here's my book with 5 million things. I'll write a very tight plan. I'll choose the locations that best describe the city, and then I will nail that in place, and that's what we write. So that's how we choose it. And I think that forgetting what we were talking about explains exactly why I do that.
That seems to match up with what chat was saying. Okay, I think we were relatively still on topic there. So one quick question I want to ask, because I'll forget if I don't ask it now. I have to ask this. Karl Franz is like, for someone that like really loves the lore and likes to really study it, he's like weirdly one of the most central figures to Warhammer Fantasy lore that is also very mysterious. Like, there's never been like a book directly about him. Like, he shows up in a lot of books, especially like when they did the Swords of the Emperor. You know, he plays kind of a major role in that story about Kurt Helborg and Ludwig Schwarzhelm. But he's this weird figure, and granted, a lot of that is due to the different interpretations, where you've got like the old version where he seems to be much older, and he has like a full family and he's got kids and all this stuff. And then you had like the 8th edition version where it almost seems implied that he's not married and he's just running around kicking ass in his 40s. And I've always wanted to ask, it seems like Games Workshop has always been kind of scared to really peg him down, because even when they released when they released the Altdorf book for Cubicle 7, we don't actually get the Karl Franz in that book. We get his double, but I don't think he has like an actual profile in the art book.
So you're not wrong. At various points, there was discussions about pinning it down. I was going to pin him down when I was doing the Altdorf book, but I left before we did. But that's because the version of the Empire that I was going to present is not the version that the enemy were then eventually presented at. They went down a slightly different route because I'd left. They didn't have all my stuff, so of course they're going in a different direction because they've got different minds coming in doing cool new stuff and adding a completely different view. Karl Franz, I remember back in 2nd edition when we were discussing it, Karl Franz was a sore point. And it was a tender point because Karl Franz had been so heavily changed between 1st edition and 2nd edition. One thing that you may not be aware of, particularly if in 2005 you were not playing Games Workshop games, like, say,
I was technically, but I was also... I started when I was 10 years old in 2001.
So I'll give you an example of what the world was like back then. Let me take you back.
Please.
To the heady years of 2005 when Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition has just released. And it is the first time that real in-detail work is beginning to get done in the Warhammer world again since the 1st edition of the role-playing game. There have been lots of broad brushstrokes with the battle game. So you've got yourself army books that discuss a unit over a page, but they don't discuss where they get their food from. They don't discuss society. They don't discuss individual factions and how they're constantly at each other's throats. Beyond the biggest stuff, like, you know, Malekith hates this person. Bum, bum, bum.
Yeah.
We're talking top level stuff. We're not talking about how Dark Elves live on a night-by-night basis inside, say, Nagaroth in some place or another, and wherever you may choose, like Haggrave or whatever. So that's not discussed, and they were coming in for the first time. And there was already, before the game was released, an enormous amount of concern because all the 1st edition fans wanted to see their version of Warhammer brought back to life. But Games Workshop's version of Warhammer by that point had Karl Franz riding a griffin, as we mentioned all the way at the beginning. As far as most of them were concerned, Heinrich Todbringer, a Todbringer from Middenheim, should probably be Emperor, not Karl Franz. Because that's loosely where the enemy then went with its 1st edition. That's what everybody expected. He effectively was, in the 1st edition of the game, spoiler alert, I'll give you a moment, but he was Sigmar Reborn.
Man, wow.
Okay, that was
concerning that from like my understanding's perspective, that is wild to hear.
Utterly wild, given where it went. And that was the world that most 1st edition fans expected. If anything, they expected to find Heinrich Todbringer sitting on that griffin. That would have made sense to them. Heinrich Todbringer, 6'7", 6'8", a giant bear of a young man. He's Sigmar Reborn, of the direct line of Sigmar. Quite literally, his ultimate descendant. That's what they expected. They didn't get that. And the war began. I cannot express to you what the Black Industries forums, Black Industries were the imprint of Black Library that dealt with the role-playing games, what the Black Industry forums were like. I was a moderator there, way back in the day. It was my job. It was my job to try and calm down that war. And might I say, I was under the moniker Sigmar back in those days because I had my own ID, but I also had my moderating Sigmar ID, which came in with a big hammer and went bong and hit people in the head when they'd gone too far. And the edition wars between 1st edition were extraordinary, ranging from simple stuff like Karl Franz, should it have a dash? Is it Karl Franz, or is it the Franz family, or is his name's Karl Franz? In truth, he's from the Hoswig-Schliesten house.
Right.
His last name isn't Franz. He doesn't have a last name. In the same way that King Charles doesn't have a last name. He's from the House of Windsor. He literally doesn't have he's not from the Franz family. Or is he? Because some books said that he was. And that got super complicated, particularly because Fantasy Roleplay 2 said the Franz family.
Yikes.
Dun, dun, dun. Lightning bolts struck from the sky. There was troops marching into the forum saying, "How dare you? He's from this household. It's this, that, and the other." And as we all know, we can get rather passionate about our lore. And if somebody comes along and rewrites it, they get very upset. Particularly if it's lore that they themselves have used, say, for example, for an army that they've collected. And they've put a particular sigil in all their shields, and then they're told, yeah, that doesn't exist anymore. We all know how upset we can get about that sort of
Right.
stuff. It was that to the nth degree because it rewrote everything and brought it up to date to Warhammer. What was then, I think, 7th edition, maybe Storm of Chaos time, maybe even end of 6th. I think it was 7th.
End of 6th, I think.
Possibly. Storm of Chaos time anyway, because it was just after Storm of Chaos that it was released. So the big, massive campaign, summer campaign, Storm of Chaos. And that was a supremely difficult time. Games Workshop were obviously concerned, particularly Black Library, because they were the ones having to deal with it all. Karl Franz was pretty much the banner issue, because it was him. Griffin riding Emperor, not very good Emperor. Diplomatic whiz kid who can rule the world, kind of pathetic, not very good at his job.
Yeah,
they are very, very different people.
I think in 7th and 8th edition, he's described as the greatest statesman in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they kept on layering it on. And with each edition, he inflated a bit further until he reached the point where he was so bloated with all the awesome that he could do. He was effectively a walking god, which is eventually, to a degree, what they did with him when the end times came. Pretty much went, you know, all those things we sort of said, well, they're true now. He's a freaking, awesome. And it became a sore point, a real sore point. And as new editions came along, the same people were often involved with the creation of the material. And they often went, let's just not cover that, because we're just going to upset someone. Let's just not do that bit. I was never that guy, ever. I'm always like, let's confront it straight on. I'll give a single example of that. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, there is a Games Master screen. It's a very simple thing.
It's so useful. All the little stuff
hide
on the
behind,
back.
you hide behind as a GM, and you're just sitting there going, whoa. And there's a big picture on that, a 4-panel piece of a Warhammer city with all manner of folk running around. It was stitched together by an artist called Sam Manley. Sam's ace. He's one of the in-house artists over at Cuba.
Yeah, I follow him on Twitter. His stuff is so good.
Yeah, Sam's awesome. And it was a bunch of individual pieces that had been created to be backdrops. They had no people on it, and we needed to get ourselves a big image, a really big image, for the GM screen, because it can't be a small one. And we decided we wanted to have this really big thing stitched together. So Sam started filling in all the details. So he started putting all the little people in, and he had a little ping over, and he said, so what exactly am I going to put on this? And I was like, well, we want everything. So I want literally anything that could pop up, popped in there somewhere, because that'd be fun. I want to have all the NPCs that be mentioned in the starter set, the characters from that, so we can have those 6 pre-generated characters on there somewhere, so if anyone's actually playing the starter set, they can find their own character sitting on the screen in front of them, because that's kind of fun. Let's do that. And I also want to have 2 gyrocopters and 2 griffin riders. And he was like, oh, that's going to upset some people. And that's the problem. That's the problem that a lot of the writers were facing. You don't want to upset your fan base. You don't want to alienate one part or make one part. But I was like, no. Your gyrocopters are not just a standard part of the background. They have been for 30 years.
Right.
I want them on the bloody box. I want it front and center, and I want Griffin Riders on it, and 2 of them, not 1. I don't want it to make it look like it's something that might have occurred once in a blue moon. 2 of them up there. And Sam was like, damn right. And away Sam went. And Sam was super excited. We loved the images it was done. Good couple of Griffin Riders up there. We looked at it, that's it. Now we look more like Warhammer. Where beforehand it looked almost like it's a pastiche of Warhammer. It's a version. And that's not what we wanted the roleplay game to be. We don't want it to be the down and dirty version of Warhammer where all those stuff that happened in the big battle games is kind of glossed over. In the same way that the big battle game is all those stuff that happens down dirty, we gloss over that. I was like, no, this is Warhammer fantasy roleplay, not just that grubby bit fantasy roleplay. So I want to make sure that they're in there too. It's one of the reasons why all of our careers don't just focus on low tier stuff. So every other edition of fantasy roleplay before the current edition focused on all the low tier stuff with a few high tier things. In this version, every low tier thing has a high tier thing it ends at. There is as many basic stuff as there is top tier stuff. And it's completely equalized across the board. So no matter what version of Warhammer you play, if you're playing a sword and sorcery, epic, hammer boshing version of Warhammer Quest, like the computer game or the old board game, rather than the new Age of Sigmar one, the older one, but it's all swing your hammers and kicking living crap out of goblins down tunnels. you've got everything you need to do that. But if yours is a down and gritty, investigative version of Warhammer, where you're going through the dark streets and occasionally encountering something awful, that can also be covered. It's meant to encompass all opportunities that the game should present, not just a single version. And that's why, for example, gyrocopters and griffins were added. And it's also why, to a degree, Karl Franz is often, and some other situations like him, put to the wayside, because there's a certain amount of sensitivity amongst some creators that they might pin down something that upsets large parts and makes it more likely you'll get yourself a negative review online.
That's so interesting to hear. Because it's an old video now and is in desperate need of updates. Because like the thing that I guess I'm like famous for is I literally will like pick a character or a theme, and I will go through my library of every book I could possibly get my hands on and try and weave it all together to make sense, you know, make it into a story. Mm-hmm. And the Karl Franz one was wild even before 4th edition came out. And like there was an interesting story because there was a lot of kind of like 8th edition really threw in a lot of weird threads to kind of try and tie his story in with a lot of the other races, where they were like this whole thing of like, oh, when he was a baby, he was attacked by beastmen and the wood elves saved him for some reason. What happened there? Yeah. And like, oh, he's fought side by side with Orion. And you're like, wow, okay. You know, all this stuff. And, but like looking at the modern stuff now, it's like, I cannot wait to redo that script of tying, because 4th edition, like for what I do especially, 4th edition has been such a godsend of like it's nightmarish as far as like the workload, but it's beautiful as far as taking all these different things of, because the thing I used to dread the most whenever I would like live stream or interact with people would someone be like, hey, what about this thing? And I'd be like, oh, okay, what is he talking about? And I'd have to go look, and he's like, okay, he's referencing a print from like 1989 that I have never seen before. And I'm like, but 4th edition really helped me personally embrace this idea of, you know what? No, we can make this work. We can approach this and like, yeah, I know there's this really weird old version of the Famir, and I know we've got our new Famir, but we can make this work. Like,
that's the original. That's the original art.
Yeah, and it's
that's like the very first ever piece of Famir art ever made. Done by Tony Ackland.
Man, there are probably so many things in that office that I would pay an ungodly amount to have in my hands. But
yeah, there's a few things.
And it's so amazing, and I'm so infinitely pleased that y'all were able to really inspire and pull this off, and they're continuing with it. You know, of that.
Makes me very happy to hear that, by the way.
Yeah, well, it's just
I put a lot of work into trying to make it all work together.
Yeah, well, it's not. I don't feel like it's a war anymore. Like, I don't feel like I used to. If you had asked me 5-10 years ago, how if someone had walked up to me and been like, hey, I know you played, like, you liked 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, well, this guy over here really liked 5th edition, what do you think? We would have been like, no.
I mean, they got cartoony knights charging. That looks ridiculous. Where's my grim and gritty black and white art?
Yeah, and it's like, but I don't feel like that at all anymore. Of like, oh yeah, no, we love the same thing. It's like, yeah, sure, it's like there's some slight differences, but there are really fun little threads that weave that together. It makes me so excited for the old world of like, oh man, we're like, instead of just bringing back what we had, they're like, hey, we're gonna go to like the Great War, which was weirdly never really expanded on, despite being like one of the most important things in the universe.
I did a big map for the battle for Kislev's Gate a long time ago for Black Library. That was a thing, and they sort of dived into it. It's in a book called Empire at War, one of Black Library's background books. You might remember, I got it right there. Nice. There you go. So there's the map I'm discussing is in there. The print that they did of it, as I recall, did some of the highlights and shades wrong because they had the layers, and unfortunately they put some of the layers in place incorrectly, which still frustrated me to this day. But it was really nice because we got to examine Azov Kull. We got to examine a whole host of details from that era. Plus, we also got to drill into the culture a little bit, where, for example, to ensure that map was immediately approachable to modern writers and modern readers of that particular set, we decided to put the Ice Queen on it, even though it was depicting a map an event from 200 years earlier. And we added a lovely little cultural thing about it being presented to the Ice Queen on her coronation. This big image of her defeating the Chaos Hordes. And how it was quite common during a new coronation of one of the Tsars or Tsarinas that large works of art were created in their honor, where all of the historical events of Kislev were repurposed to show why they were awesome. And it was just a really nice little cultural detail. But that book's got a little bit about it, but you're absolutely right. The Old World, I think, is going to be fascinating. I'm really enjoying watching the creepy, crawly releases from it because I go, oh, that bit's exactly the way I made it. That's really cool. Look, they've used that bit from my map. That's awesome. Oh, that bit's been completely changed. That's also awesome. Wonder why they did that. It's been really interesting to see what sources they've used. As somebody who's been responsible for creating large chunks of different parts of what they're using, it's been really fascinating, particularly because there's already quite a lot of detail from that era and they've already started rewriting it. And for me, I'm always a fan of that because others see it and they get angry and they're like, why would you change that? Why would you do this? Why would you remove this family and put a different family instead? Why would you change the history? Where I'm all like, well, how can I make that work? Always my first thought nowadays. How can I make that work? How can I make what they've written marry with what's already there? For example, just a single one, House Hallskrug, their very famous Altdorf line were emperors. They were the electoral emperors during the time of three emperors after the collapse of all empire. But they were emperors at the time. Bet they won't become the Old World. It'll be a completely different one. They will build their own families and almost certainly reinforce the Holzrichs-Liestens, Karl Franz. They'll want to say, this is Karl Franz's granddad or some equivalent, because they'll want to reinforce and connect to and bridge into the more modern setting that everybody knows from Total War et al. So they will rewrite bits, so be prepared for that. So if you know your lore really, really well, prepare to be either A, upset or super excited by it, depending upon how you tackle
being
these
upset's
things.
Overrated. It's so much more exciting to like be able
It totally is. I love it.
It's like, and already like the fact that the old world's like, yeah, we're going to Cathay. Yeah, it's the Total War Cathay. Yeah, Miao Ying and Zhao Ming are gonna be there, and I'm like, oh, are we gonna get to see the other dragon kids? Like you get like, hey, Total War kind of implies that Shinzu might still be around at this point, like the Dragon of Light. So I'm really, maybe we can see her. God, just great stuff. So I've got a couple of questions coming in from chat, and I wanted to kind of give them their moment to leap in. Just
come on, chat, give it to me.
Yeah. So first, I've been watching it the whole time. There have been so many people that come in and they go, oh, is that an N7 sweater? I love that.
Damn straight it is.
What a culture,
I'm a huge Mass
man.
Effect fan. Yep, I'm a massive. Where's my N7? There's my N7. I'm a huge Mass Effect fan and Dragon Age fan as well. Probably more a Mass Effect fan than the other way around. Maybe. I fully accept the flaws of the game. The end, the last 10 minutes are absolutely bobbins. I nevertheless love it.
Yeah. So that leads into another question. So people in chat are asking so outside of Warhammer, what are your other favorite universes? There's kind of, people are already kind of picking out a couple of things you got behind you. But like, do you have, there's some like Star Wars and some other stuff back there.
Yeah.
What are kind of your favorites?
I'm a geek. I'll just put it right out there. I play games all the time. Not just because I really enjoy playing games, but because I'm constantly analyzing, taking ideas, looking at how they did certain things and wondering why, and nailing down what I would do if I did it differently. So if you name a major fantasy or sci-fi thing, I have probably been a fan of it at some point. And yes, I am a fan of, say, Star Wars. I'm a fan of Doctor Who. I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings. I'm a fan of pretty much freaking everything. I will watch and enjoy almost anything, even the bad stuff. I'm a big role player, so I role play a lot. Of late, and it's been mostly Warhammer, and as I've said before, we're going to be doing a big stream for that.
So excited.
Yeah. Oh, actually, on that, just as a small aside, if you're interested in the story of Karl Franz, I will be pitching you one that will blow your freaking mind.
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter what you're going to do. I'm going to be there to watch it.
No. The Karl Franz story is going to blow your mind.
Well, I'll fucking be there.
It's actually going to blow your mind.
As long as you're cool with me making a video about it, like.
Okay, and as much as I say I may be overblowing this, I am not.
I don't think
I am
you're
going to
overblowing
blow your mind. Okay, when we reach episode, I'm guessing around 40ish area, it'll start to nail home. But that
Jesus.
aside, it's quite a while in. But it's about episode 4. I've got an entire
teasing me
plan,
already, and it's 40 episodes away.
Yeah, I have
That's not
plans.
nice. That's not nice, Andy.
It's awesome. It's an idea that I pitched to Graham some time ago. Graham Davis, who created the original Enemy Within, just in case you're coming into the stream late. And he was like, "This is the best idea ever. We have to do it." But I left, so we never did that idea. So I'm going to do it on my stream. So this is awesome. I'm really looking forward to doing it because it's going to be hopefully very unexpected. Anyway. Computer games, I play literally everything. So I'm a bit of a fan of a base builder or a tower defense game. I'm a little bit a fan of your first-person action games. So single-player games rather than online games. Never really been a huge online player. Role-playing games are obviously right up there. So our Mass Effects are one of my faves. But beyond that, yeah, everything. I also, just as another aside, I'm the CEO. I'm co-owner of Rookie Publications. I can't even speak. We've got our first board game coming out. It's currently with Modifius, if you know Modifius. They're a boards game company.
Okay.
They're doing the printing for that, which we built that with Mark and Andy Chambers, if you know Andy Chambers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why are there so many Andys?
They just are.
Like,
it's just
there are people
of my
in chat...
generation. Of my generation, Andrew, I came from a tiny school in the north of Scotland in a place called Golspie, and my class had 16 people in it. 3 of them were called Andrew.
There are so many questions in chat where people are asking Total War ones, and it's like, this isn't Andy Hall, it's Andy Law.
It's not. Terribly sorry, different Andy. Although we do have a show with Andy Hall on the Rookery.
It's
so
very
on
good.
The Rookery publication side, it was a fun one actually. We spoke with Andy Hall just before the release of the Chaos Dwarfs.
That actually.
So there was an awful lot of. I mean, are they coming?
Speaking of Chaos Dwarfs,
we
do have a question coming in here from a person in chat named Godzilla who asks, so how do you like the Chaos Dwarfs as far as like kind of what we've been talking about today? Total War kind of took the classic ones and the Forge World design and sort of melded them together.
I was expecting them to be more like the Forge World ones. I was quite convinced that's what we were going to get. And then when I saw them, I was like, "Holy crap! They look like Mark Gibbons stuff." To speak about Mark Gibbons,
right.
Mark Gibbons is Mark Gibbons is my business partner in Rookery Publications. And we were like, "What the fuck? That's all your Chaos Dwarfs, Mark." And Mark was like, "Holy shit!" So Mark immediately went and posted on Facebook all of his original Chaos Dwarf stuff from the very first.
Yeah, that was the thread I saw, and I was like, "Oh
yeah,"
Mark
and he
stuff.
was like, "Look at this shit because it's in the game." Yes. That put a big happy smile in our faces because we are somewhat of a fan of the old big-hatted Chaos Dwarves. We can't help ourselves. I do love them. I remember at the time, it was the conversation spanning out of if you don't have a big hat, you can't be a character in Warhammer. And the bigger your hat, the more powerful you are. So clearly the Chaos Dwarves were one of the most powerful species on the entire Warhammer world because they have the biggest hat.
Yeah. About 50% of their mini was hat.
Yeah, totally. They were the hat wearers. But yeah, I like them a lot, and I understand that I imagine some won't and some will love them because everyone's got a different opinion. That's just how it is. But for me, I think great, a lovely merging of the two, and it speaks to one of the things that I've in my creation always attempted to do as well, which is try and draw all the cool together into one amalgam, into something that is Warhammer, and everybody can see their Warhammer in it. Whether they come from the Forge World version or whether they come from the old, well, that would have been for 4th edition Warhammer did that one come out. Chaos Dwarf Army List.
Yes, 4th, I believe.
Off the top of my head, it could have been 5th. Regardless, doesn't really matter which edition it was. It's pretty freaking old now.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I'm thinking of the spine. It's the same spine as the 4th edition spines. Anyway, that by the by. I love them a lot. And yeah, on the things I like, building stuff I like, board game, that's fun. Role-playing games, really fun. We're building Coil Crown Bits just now, which is super fun. It's taking all the stuff I love from Warhammer, all the stuff I love from all the other fantasy games, piling it all into one place, and it's so much fun. We are really, really, really enjoying ourselves.
I'm glad. It's good to hear. Your passion is infectious, which is delightful.
No, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, our first book, it's going to be called Ship of Fools, and it's a roleplay book adventure for any system. So you could play it with D&D, you could play it with Warhammer, you could play it with Cthulhu. Indeed, one of the people, when they played it during our playtest, they didn't have a ship of fools, they had a spaceship of fools, and they set it in Firefly, and another one set it in, what's his face? Doesn't matter. It was another sci-fi setting.
Oh, that's super interesting. Okay. All right.
So
I look forward to checking that out.
Yeah, it's completely different while simultaneously very similar to all the stuff that we've created before.
That's coming up, or that's been released?
Oh, that's coming up.
Coming
up. Mark Gibbons, the artist we were discussing before, who did all the Chaos Dwarves et al., he's doing all the art for that just now. It's laid out. He's just finishing off all the art pieces. But Mark is a perfectionist, so it will keep on going till it's done.
Fair enough.
It's written. It's looking lovely.
All right, so I've got a couple of some rapid fire questions for you. So
yes, let's go.
We got one from Variant Voiceover, who did the voice of Fenrir in that video.
You're awesome!
There you go, Variant. You can go to sleep with that. So he asks, which Warhammer race do you think has the most compelling story?
Oh my goodness, that's a little bit like saying choose between your babies.
Yeah.
Compelling story. See, there's a funny old thing with Warhammer because it's very easy to focus on the areas that have had the most story.
Right.
And the most story almost certainly has fallen on the Empire. The center of the old world, which pretty much became the center of the end times as well.
Right.
What happened with Grand Cathay and the Pawn and all the rest during the end times?
Yeah, very.
Who knows?
Pretty
Pretty
common criticism. Yeah, world's ending. Let's just focus on this little stretch.
It was a really European, weird end to the world, and yeah. So they've had certainly some of the best stories, because they've had the most stories. If you look at the novels, most of the novels were set there, and it's really easy to follow those. But if I look at the overall species and the ones that I've enjoyed most, it's hard not to love the elves. I had this conversation with Gav Thorpe, actually, where Gav hates the elves. And absolutely despises them, although he does write novels about them, obviously.
Right, yeah.
He loves dwarves, absolutely adores the dwarves. And I'm quite the... It's not so much I'm the fan of the elves. I think there's a beautiful, heart-wrenching, awful story being told there. And how the end of the world happened, and I won't go into all the end time stuff,
right?
But it was very close to what I had already done when I blew up my Warhammer world. Parts of it were quite similar, particularly with Malekith.
We're going to have to get some details from your version of that one day.
You do not want my heretical version of how the world ended. I have pictures online of 40k stuff being involved. That, I think, is enough to make everybody flee
we already got
to the hills in terror.
We already had Kabanda, the main villain of Book 5, okay? Like, it already happened.
Yeah, it did. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the elves. I love what they did with the Lizardmen in the end, because they really brought that back, and they took what could have been a very problematic setting and they twisted it around into something that was super awesome. Watching how the Lands of the Dead progressed and changed into what it is currently has been, I think, super fascinating.
Yeah.
To its detriment, it sort of wiped out undead in other parts of the world, and it's been interesting watching how that slowly crept back. Lice, for example, used to be very common, or liches, depending how you want to pronounce it. Across the old world, where they very much withdrew south and became very much a thing of the land of the dead.
It took some digging. When I did the lore video on Heinrich Himmler, and it took some digging to figure out, like, okay, why is this guy called the Lich Master? To realize, we do have liches from other parts of the world, and they're not Tomb Kings. They're their own distinct thing. But they're very and the roleplay is the way I was able to dig that up.
Yep, that's where it's all. Terror of the Lich Master is a particularly interesting one, because it was both roleplay and battle game. So you had the battle game expansion that got turned into a roleplay expansion, and the battle for La Maison Tal there's some interesting details in there.
Yeah,
particularly with the Skaven and the Black Ark. Oh, just superb. Anyway, putting all that aside, I'm going to drop down one Skaven.
Okay. Another question. Okay, so this one, so in my community, there's a very big meme because I'm a huge fan of them and their potential. What are your thoughts on the mysterious fishmen of the oceans?
Fishmen! Oh my goodness. The number of times that's come up, because I stream every week doing some mapping.
Yes.
It's just me and whoever happens to turn up. They're lovely little streams because they're super quiet. It's just me ticking away doing a map of a place called Callaghan in the Reichland. And we're slowly building it up. And people, whenever they pop into the stream, they will drop in and they will say something like, have you considered putting one of these here? It's a diplomatic center for the Reichland. So it's a super important place. It's run by the Hallskrugs, one of the most important families, which we mentioned earlier in the stream of Reichland. And it makes for a super fascinating thing. The number of times freaking fishmen are brought up. Oh my goodness! It was a constant thing throughout the first 5 or 6 years. Have you considered fishmen? Fishmen in particular, it's something that Graham and I talked about. That's Graham Davis, again, harking back to him, because he added them in Fantasy Roleplay 1 a bajillion years ago.
Yeah.
And it has become one of those undercurrent things that keeps on popping up its little fishy head every once in a while. What do I think? I think they should run with it and turn it into something awesome.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
I did we did kind of a little series where I paid an artist because there's a few descriptions of them that appear from time to time. So I paid an artist to create some art, and it turned out beautiful, of these horrific needle-fanged aquatic men creatures, and did a lot of digging and came up with a lot of theories. I think one of my favorite theories I came up with was blaming the Fishmen for the earthquake that sucked Chup Yodel, being the revenge of the Fishmen against the creations of the old ones for coming to their planet and forcing them anyway. But it's like there's such a fun like conspiracy that is also vaguely backed up, and they show up in a lot of places where you go, oh, if they're real, they are kind of everywhere, which means they're probably kind of terrifying and kind of big.
Potentially also behind the cursed marshes around Marienburg, and the fall of the Fimmer that used to be there. There's lots of different little rumors that pop up. Yeah, I think they're awesome. I think there's this lovely back-burning question that should have an answer at some point, and the old world provides a potential option for doing that.
Yeah,
I would love them to plumb into a species that have never been touched before.
Yeah.
Particularly because in Age of Sigmar, they sort of ran along that route and they came up with some really nice things.
Yeah, oh man, I lost my mind when they released the Idoneth Deepkin book, and they were like, yes, we have these guys called the Abhalons now, and I'm like, Fishmen! We have an AOS now.
Totally.
So
100%.
Decol86 asks, did you play or either play it now on the private server or when it was live, the Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning game?
Yes, I ran my own guild back in those days.
What'd you play? What was your career?
Which one do I choose?
What was your main?
I played them all. It's like choosing between babies. You kind of can't. They're your children. Yeah, I played them all. That was part of my fun because I loved drilling into all the lore that we're building. I was actually approached to write in it, but I didn't want to move to America. Which is where they wanted me to be, and I was like, yeah, no,
I don't blame you.
Get out of it. I live in Scotland, okay, thanks, bye. I'm going to stay in Scotland, and that's just the way it's going to be. But I knew quite a few of the writing team, and we were chatting away about all the things they were doing, so it was super fun for me to go in and see how they did it. And it's inevitably always the case for someone who's super lore heavy. You meet some characters, and you're like, seriously? That's how they're depicting it? Because you can't help it. Valmor von Raukov, where was Valmer's mustache?
Yeah, there were definitely some hilarious, like, weird, like, not cut corners, but, like, there were some times where you'd run to a model and go, that's not what he looks like. Who's this guy?
Yeah, totally. But I loved it, regardless of the lore, let's say, cut corners that it took.
They made it work.
I really enjoyed playing it. I've been tempted multiple times almost to go back to the Revivified server where it's being run privately. I've almost done it, but my free time is so low because I'm doing so much.
All I'll say is they got Karazakarak and Black Crag up and running, which was not in live. So, like, you can actually go explore the Dwarf and Greenskin capitals now. They're very cool.
That'd be fucking cool.
They're very nice.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, you're getting me now.
Hey, you should.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sure the devs would be delighted to give you a tour. They're very nice people.
Are they? Well, if they happen to be out there and want to get in contact, at Epimacies on Twitter, I'll happily take a tour around.
I will reach out to them as soon as this is over because I have their personal stuff. I'm sure they would be delighted to show you around. because I need it, because it's like I want to get back to playing, but I'm so busy with all the Chaos Dwarf stuff.
Yeah,
but
so busy. Yeah.
If there could be 3 of me that could share a consciousness, that would be so great.
My life would be so much easier.
Okay, so Kamiya asks, I don't know if there's a serious answer to this question, but if there is, it would delight me. Some authors do this, some don't. Do you happen to have a self-insert character anywhere in the Warhammer Fantasy universe?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We need to know who it is.
Yes, I do, but it's not one that I've written.
Oh.
Because I literally couldn't do that. I tried, but I just found it horrendous. I found it really tough. So I'm going to mention a couple of things here, because there's a couple of different routes that we can take in here. Number one, whenever I do a city map, I put my house in it.
Okay.
So that's an easy one. Next one, the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 inside sleeves have got a map of the glorious Reichland. It's a double page spread on the inside sleeve.
Beautiful map.
Oh, thank you for saying so. I drew that. So that particular map, I don't know if I've got a copy around me here.
I got my collector's edition. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, I've got a collector's edition somewhere too. I've got number.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I have like an auto green screen that's very, very particular.
Yeah.
Whatever. Whatever. I'll put it up as the thumbnail.
Wait a minute. I can do the same on my side. So I'm pretty sure I've got a copy here. There you go. Right. I'll reach round and go. I'm not sure how well that's going. This map here now in the corner. There's a little bit with the heraldry there, and underneath it it says from the actual surveys by A. Richter. A. Richter meaning almost lawyer in German. So A. Law and L. Koch. My wife's maiden name was Cook. L. Cook. So that's a map that was commissioned by me and my wife. It's not really much of a self-insert. It's the tiniest of self-inserts.
It's a beautiful self-insert.
A. Richter is mentioned there. I've used A. Richter in a couple of different things in Warhammer. There was a cartographer mentioned somewhere in an adventure somewhere that was also called A. Richter. But on a more obvious self-insert, but it's not really a self-insert, is characters that have developed significantly over the course of time in my games often get moved into any of my official writing because it makes it so much easier to understand the characters rather than just create something up from fresh. And in some cases, they were central to core plot points. As a single example, in the Tome of Salvation. So that's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2 time, released in about 2007-8, somewhere in there.
Amazing, amazing book for background lore. Like, my God, the stuff on the, I just have to gush for a second. The stuff on the original human culture before all of the, Sigmarite cultures moved in, that stuff, it's fucking incredible. And it does so much crazy world building for this druidic culture that predates everybody. They've got the whole Earth Mother thing. They understood who the old ones were. They have a reference to Sotek on one of their monoliths, which you're like, what the but they weren't a warlike culture, so they got wiped out, and you're like, fuck. This is really good.
I wrote that. Yeah, that was me. So that bit you love. Yay, I wrote it.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, I enjoyed that book a lot because it was an opportunity to dive into a lot of lore that Warhammer had previously sort of sidelined, particularly with its focus on the Empire and Sigmar, where everything was Sigmar. Sigmar. And I was quite happy to do things like make Myrmidia a significantly more deep and expanded cult. So rather than her just being an Athena ripoff, which is what she had been previously, she was developed into a goddess of the entire South, possibly the largest cult in the old world, significantly more influential than Sigmar, which was largely just the cult of the Empire.
Yeah, well, Sigmar's a baby. He's only been around for 2,500 years.
Indeed, and also adding in nice little lore details about how, say, Myrmidia had actually come and as manifested as immortal.
Awesome story.
Yeah, her totally. And
life story.
And that was all added during that period. But in the Ulrich section of that, there's a discussion about Ulrican politics and how Ulrican priests are forced to take a vow of celibacy because of political things from the past. And one of the little adventure hooks at the bottom there explains how that had recently been put into stark light because Heinrich Todbringer, who was a politician side, harking right back to our earlier mentions of Heinrich Todbringer before, had recently impregnated a priestess of Ulrich, effectively creating exactly everything that wasn't supposed to happen.
Right.
which is a dynasty that rivaled the Todbringers, and the Todbringers themselves are breaking it, which is causing all manner of schisms within the Cult of Ulrich and the nobles. She is pictured later in the book, right at the very end in the artifact section. In the artifact section, there's a picture of a priestess with a big white wolf pelt sitting across her shoulders with Middenheim in the background, the big, huge rise of rock, and the city sitting at the top of it. And she's sitting there. It's a picture that had been commissioned by Boris Todbringer because basically his son had impregnated her.
Yeah. He's like, we gotta make this look good.
That's my wife's character.
That's amazing.
And she's also a writer for Warhammer. So yeah, good times.
Like I said, what I want to be when I grow up. I may be 30, but I still haven't grown up.
But the reason that I used her was because that was a story that had come up in our games, and when I was looking at each one of the schisms that we created for the cult, I was like, how can I best? I've already got a really good example of conflict. And one of the things when you're writing a roleplay game is that you need to seed conflict through everything. And conflict is not just hitting someone with hammer over the head. It's all about people having different views to other people and having to resolve it. Because that conflict is at the heart of most stories. People disagreeing with each other and trying to fix it one way or another, and often in Warhammer, with a hammer.
Yeah.
And looking at each one of those conflicts and how best to express it, and she expressed it beautifully, because she pretty much summed up all of the issues with that particular schism in the cult. So she just got added. It was easier than trying to create something new.
Which is awesome. And it works so well. Yeah. Okay, so next quick question. So something that a lot of people don't get to experience, and I just have to ask about because it's so crazy to watch. You created all these wonderful, beautiful things. They've come out of your head. They're your babies. And now they have become a worldwide beloved world that's being adapted into video games, and audio dramas and books. And you've got people like me who literally study what you wrote as a career, and it's a profitable career that allows me to like I get to travel the world because of the shit that you wrote. Like,
yeah, great, well done. I wish I did.
Yeah. It's like I've been on a movie set for a fan-made movie that's going to come out this year, the Chaos Rising stuff. That's why I was in Scotland. And it's literally those people just bringing your stuff to life. What I have to ask, what is it like to like see stuff like Total War or Vermintide or the roleplay games, or how like the old world coming back is this like cultural phenomenon? It's like, that's you.
Not just me. One part of a very large team.
Right.
Not to get big-headed. I was just one member of a very large team, all of whom have added different things over time. But it is weird. I'll give an example of how I found it weird. I was working my way through Vermintide, enjoying the game, seeing things in it, and I was like, oh, that's a thing I did, that's pretty cool. And there's a thing, oh, that's pretty cool too. And then I went down to Games Workshop for one of our events. I think it was actually Warhammer Fest. It was Warhammer Fest. So I went down for Warhammer Fest. And Warhammer Fest is this lovely collection, not just of fans, but of all the creators of not just the studio and the people around there, but all of the license creators coming together. And I was down there to do effectively a speech where I was going to explain how the Enemy Within wasn't just going to be a reimagining of the Enemy Within campaign, it was going to be a bridge between Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 and Warhammer 8. And I was there to present that to all of the fans and to also tell the licensing people and everyone else how it was all going to work. And that was super fun. And we did a nice little speech, did the thing. Sat at a stall, but eventually I sat down after the event with the Vermintide crew. Lovely people. And it was the weirdest thing because they were all gushing and going, oh, we got to meet Andy and we're doing this. And I was like, whoa. Because I wanted to meet them because I really enjoyed their game.
Yeah.
And I was like, tell me your stuff. And it was really weird. That was of all the things that I've done. And I remember sitting beside Zachary Levy once, of all people. Because I happened to be invited to a con somewhere where he was also invited. What the fuck am I doing with him here? I just made a role-playing game. What the hell? That was weird. I got a nice picture with oh god, I've forgotten his name. It doesn't really matter who it was. He's an actor. But yeah, that was weird. But what's it like? It's a bit weird. I love it because every time that something that I've created is respun in a new way, I can see that thing, what I did do maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, completely built in a completely new and often exciting way. I just love it. it's just super exciting. I know that's a really bland, gushy response, but
I think it's a great response.
The truth. I actually love it, and I get quite a few messages from people who are fans of the older setting and don't like where new steps have been taken, for example. And they're like, aren't you a bit upset that this thing's been written, or that this thing has overwritten the thing you did? And I'm like, no, because I sort of did the same when I tried to make it all sense myself. Because there's always going to be a bit of lore that contradicts with another, and you have to make a choice as to how they get incorporated. And sometimes they just don't mesh. A classic example will be the town of Del Bears. I know this is going to sound weird, but the town of Del Bears used to be down in the south of Middenland. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2 moved it into the middle of Middenland because the Storm of Chaos moved it into the middle of Middenland.
Oh.
So the studio rewrote its position. Which meant that the beginning of the Enemy Within campaign, which is supposed to start in Del Bears, really close to Altdorf, can't start in Del Bears because it's now up in the middle. People got up in arms at the time when it got moved. They were like, how can you move an entire town? It'd be a little bit like moving Nuln to Talabheim. You can't do that. How did Nuln become Talabheim? They're two different places. Games Workshop do this frequently. Almost every map they release has got a new location on it, or a location that used to be on that side of the river, now on this side of the river, or up there, and it's now become down there. It's par for the course.
Right.
When you write the role-playing game, you fix it. We even have a little comic aside inside one of the role-play games where it says Del Bears and Del Bren with a little arrow pointing both directions.
Yeah, I love those little Grognard notes.
Yeah, I replaced Del Bears in the Enemy Within with Del Bren. And it was a mapping issue. Okay, so we wrote it into the background that people got confused between the two locations, and we wrote it in as a sign.
That's amazing.
Saying that people got confused between the two locations, because there's no reason for you to get angry about it. You can make it all make sense if you wish to do so. It's a broken world where nobody's got all the facts. It's easy to get stuff wrong.
Yeah, one of the players in the campaign I'm GMing is like, hey, we were just in Delbers because I had a start in Middenheim, so we went down through. We took the Middenheim to Altdorf road, which took us through Delbers, and they got to deal with the shrine there, the Conic Plague shrine with the Grand Theogenes hand. They stole some of his fingernail clippings and gave it to someone. Yeah, gave it to someone who totally has good intentions, and that won't come back to bite them at all.
Good times.
Oh man. Okay, so I would love to keep talking for eternity. I am looking at the time. We have been going for about 2 hours.
We've been almost 2 hours already. Yeah. Well, I'm used to long streams. My first mapping stream for the Callaghan was 7 hours long.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
And I sat down, I started, and I just kept on going. And I didn't even realize the time. I was just chatting away because our streams they're basically lore chats.
Yeah.
And everybody pitches ideas, and I explain why ideas work or don't work. So they just end up becoming often deep dives into obscure cults and which ones would fit and wouldn't fit in the individual area. And apparently that takes 7 hours for the first of our streams. There's over 50 hours of us mapping and chatting random lore now.
That's so yeah, and yeah. I've heard quite a bit. So okay, I have to ask about cartography real quick because you're a prolific map maker and your maps are beautiful.
I am.
I have them hanging on my walls.
Super. Thank you.
Because they're great. So fun fact, the Cubicle 7 guys reached out to me about the Lustria stuff, and they were like, hey, we'd like to do an interview and stuff after stuff comes out, and so you can ask questions. I'm like, yeah, I'm super excited. And when they released the book, I did a live stream reaction to it, and it was super fun. We had a good time, and they emailed me and they were like, so you were a lot more excited about the maps than we thought anybody was going to be. So I guess we've decided we're going to release the maps now as a separate release to go alongside, because otherwise we weren't going to do that. It's like, please, people like maps. They're very nice.
Maps always win. One of the things I'm doing for a stream of the Enemy Within is I'm going to be building all the maps that I need for it, and I'll just be popping them all up for free.
Yeah, so I think I've used some of your maps. I think
it wouldn't surprise me. There's going to be a bunch more popping up online. Much like the Glorious Right Clan, I'm building a Glorious Middenland, an equivalent of that just now. It will be quite unlike the released ones because I no longer need to build it solely for Games Workshop. I'm building this for myself, my own campaign, so I can just wholesale create it as I require. But I'm going to be using the master map. For those of you who don't know out there, when I was employed so we're talking the mid-noughties now. In the mid-noughties, I was employed to map the entirety of the Empire. for the role-playing game. That book never got released. That doesn't really matter. But for that, I resecured every single Games Workshop source that had ever been pretty much published, went through them all, and found every single location that had been mentioned, whether it was in comics, whether it was in computer games, whether it was in novels, the board game White Dwarf, whatever. And I piled them onto what became my master map, which was the map that lay behind all the maps that I did for the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And it was one gigantic collection of everything Games Workshop had ever done in the Empire together. And that's what I'm going to be using. That's what I use, for example, for the Glorious Reichland. That's what lies behind it, all the cities that are located there, many of which people were like, this is new. And I was like, it's really not.
Yeah.
This one's mentioned in this book. This one's mentioned in this book. This one's mentioned over there. This one came from White Dwarf number whatever. All these things have been added to the Empire at some point. It's just all of it for the first time. Normally, Games Workshop only sticks upon those tent poles that they always know. Nuln, Altdorf, Talabheim.
Yeah, they're like,
the primary.
Yeah.
And then when they fall into the middle areas, they're like, that's all the places our writers worry about.
Yeah.
And they make up as they need for each one of their various productions. Where I wasn't doing that, I was taking all of the writer's stuff and making that. So I'm going to be doing an equivalent map for Midland, for example. And I'm just going to put that for free over my blog because
I cannot wait to see that.
That'll be fun. You better print it out and do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, I'm going to use it in a lot of videos. Is what I'm going to do.
Good times.
Okay, so one question that I saw asked that's a great question. Do you have
Sure.
like either an idea or a character or race? Do you have a white whale as far as like something that you wish you had gotten to do that either Games Workshop was like,
yes.
Games Workshop was like, nah, we don't want to do that, or there just wasn't time or something?
No, actually. Okay, so I'm going to say both yes and no to this. I found Games Workshop never said no. Not to me, at least. But there's a reason for that. It's because I'm so steeped in Warhammer lore. It's pretty much in every grain and bone of my body that I'm never pitching anything to them that isn't Warhammer.
Right.
What I'm pitching to them is their own material, sometimes rejigged in a new way, sometimes looked at from a different angle, but ultimately it's Games Workshop shit, and it's awesome. So every time I've said, this is what I'd like to do, they've gone, yeah, great, brilliant. Whenever I'm going into something that I think they're going to say no to because it's a bit weird or because it's older material that perhaps needs a lot of re-examining before it's re-presented, I never say this is what I want to do. I always say these are the options. Which one would you like to take? So, for example, yeah, because it's just a better route. They say I want that one, and I'm like, great, that's the one. I'll do
then we're going. Yeah.
So, for example, I was organizing the final. Let's say, setup for a book called Rough Nights and Hard Days. Rough Nights and Hard Days was a collection of adventures that was originally 3 adventures, and when I took over it became 5 adventures that we built with Graham Davis. And I added 2 sections to the end of that about pub games that are played in the Empire, because who doesn't like to play pub games? And gnomes. And gnomes were, let's say, somewhat controversial. And I realised this because I looked at the original adventure, Rough Night at the Three Feathers Inn, and it had a gnome in it. It was from first edition. And there were no gnomes in second edition. When the second edition version of that adventure was published, they replaced him with a halfling. And they said, he's a halfling. So I looked at it and I went, gnomes, interesting. I could write gnomes pretty freaking well. But they're not really in Warhammer anymore. But Warhammer's a really open place nowadays. It's not like it used to be where they were very tightly just on the war game. Now they're far more, it's a big world full of stuff and all sorts of things could be there. So they might like it. And I thought I would, if I was receiving this, because I went through the whole process in my mind, because before you pitch something, you got to think what's going to go and what's not going to go. I went, if I was receiving this, what would I say? It would have to be really Warhammer to work. Okay, I can do that. Right, so I sent off an email, and I said, right, so we've got gnomes here. I can either make it a halfling, that's what second edition did. I can make it a gnome, which means I'm going to have to add something to explain that, so I'll write about 5 pages worth of super Warhammer gnomes. But I'll have to write it in a way that explains why they're not anywhere else, and they've not been spotted anywhere else, which means I'm going to have to write it in a very Warhammery way that makes sense with that within the setting. Or alternatively, we can just dump them completely and just make it human. So, gnomes, no gnomes, I'm totally cool with whatever you want. Pitched it over to them. Came back, do the fucking gnomes. So I did. And the gnomes that were added at the back of Rough Nights and Hard Days, I got Mark Gibbons. who you may have noted already, is my go-to piece of art.
He keeps coming up for some reason.
Mark's amazing. He did the 2 pieces of art for the gnomes in that book. And they're super great. You might know Mark not just from Warhammer, but he was also the lead artist on Warcraft, for example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mark gets about. He also worked for Sony for a long time, and I think so. I forget. Loads of computer gamey stuff. He's awesome. So Mark did the treatment for that. So he did the concepting for them. And I sat down and I was like, right, now I've got only 5 pages to build an entire culture for an entire species. To not only do that, because it's a roleplay game, these have to be playable. So I need to also include stats, names, how they appear, why they don't see. Oh my goodness, how am I going to plan this one out? So I spent about 4 days on just the plan to try and squeeze it all into just 5 pages.
And you fucking did it. That's the thing that blows my mind.
Very much. I'm very pleased with how it came out. I wanted to do so much more, and before I left, I was going to do so much more. We're going to be doing in the first archives book, where I was going to detail those a bit more, but instead we went down the halfling route instead, and they covered the moot. But that was originally going to be a piece written by me about the gnomes and different gnomes. But I sort of wrote a bit more about that, slapped it on a blog, just because I had it in the back of my head, and I was like, I'll quickly tap that out. I'll maybe give you a link to it later, just so you can go find it.
Yes, please.
I did a quick little bit about each one of the different gnomish kingdoms. Kingdoms? Yeah, let's call them that. In the Empire. And presented them in a somewhat similar way to how they were presented in, say, the Wood Elf army list, when it was talking about each one of them.
Right.
It's not the same, but it's close enough. So it was an immediately accessible piece, and you could recognize it as a piece of Warhammer lore, and that was quite fun. So I got that out the way because it was in my head, and I wanted to write that bit, so I had to get it down and get it out the way. But that's very much a fan piece that just got popped up on my blog. So that was something that wasn't my white whale that I wanted to track down. But most certainly was something that I expected to be, because by the time I'd sent off the email asking them to do it, I was like, I'm really wanting to write this. And this was from someone who had never used a gnome in any of his games ever. And suddenly I was super excited. I was sitting there going, and I could use Grom the Paunch to explain this, and I could do, and I could do this, and I could really tie it in that way. Got super excited. And I thought it was going to be a white whale because I was convinced I was going to be told no. But if we go to an actual white whale, it's the Enemy Within campaign itself, because I didn't finish it. Graham and I had a plan for how it was going to be finished. It was all in my head, but I left the job, which meant that it never got finished the way I was going to do it. Which means the Enemy Within campaign has all of the seeds that I sowed, because I did all the first treatments and everything. I wrote the first treatments for the last 2 books, but they've been executed in a completely different way. And much like the gnomes, I've got this burning urge to try out some of the things that were imagined between Graham and I, or that I presented to him. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing the actual play, because I've got to vent the ideas somewhere.
I cannot wait to see it. Also, you should totally do like a blog on your Karl Franz stuff.
The Karl Franz stuff, I'll probably do the blog when the campaign's done, because
that makes sense.
Frankly, oh my goodness. But yeah, that's it's a core story of the Enemy Within, and it's actually, if I was going to say it's the white whale, that's probably it. It wasn't because it was nixed by Games Workshop. Games Workshop had already approved this part. It's because it never happened. It never happened.
It's funny, in the community of Warhammer fans, there's so many like mythologies and legends about GW, and they're kind of portrayed in this very like fashion. I don't think I've ever heard a story of them saying no to something other than, like, I've heard stories of them.
They do a lot.
Yeah.
They do a lot. Okay, let's be 100% honest. They hold their IP very closely because it's their intellectual property, and they are very concerned that anything that is created hits a certain level. Now, that level is going to be very different for a mobile game to what it is for a big war game, to what it is for a role-playing game, what it is to a novel. But they hold it quite tightly, and they will very carefully pick apart everything that you do. I'm lucky, geeky, depending upon how you look at it, because I know almost all the lore. So even when Games Workshop comes back and says it shouldn't be this, I say, well, this is why it is this. Do you want me to change it? But it's this because of something that's said over here. And they generally go, oh, you know what? That's really cool that you're referencing that. That's brilliant. Away you go. So I have had, personally, a marvelous relationship, but I know many who have not.
Interesting.
But that's because but that's because they're often pitching things that don't quite match what Games Workshop wants at that time. Games Workshop is a constantly changing company, just like any other company. And their focus moves from one game to another game, from one pillar to another pillar. And as that focus changes, it's going to put more critical eyes upon the material that's being created. For example, right now, there's probably a more critical eye being put on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay than there was when I was creating it and being the producer just a few years back, because of the old world.
Yeah.
The old world has now become something that they are actively developing, which means that anything that comes out from other people is going to have to at least match or potentially become the outcome of what they're building, which means that they're going to pour over everything that comes in with a far tighter eye, perhaps. Now, that might not be the case. I'm not talking to you just now. They might be behind the scenes going, nah, it's all cool. But broadly speaking, that has been my experience in the past. There was a lot of, as an example, you really enjoyed the first chapter from the Tome of Salvation. There was quite a lot of material in that was considered to be relatively controversial. Because it was making sense of a lot of the different background decisions that had either been ditched, moved aside, or moved on from. Druids, for example, the great druidic families. And a discussion was had behind the scenes as to, do we even want this in? Do we want to have tech lists going to the great druidic families? Okay, and saying, you're wrong! You're wrong!
Yeah.
These great menhirs that you're worshipping are actually old waystones, and this is the proof. Now, he happened to choose one that was the proof. It doesn't mean that he was 100% right either. Plus, Teclis had his own. You know, I'm not saying that elves manipulate people, but you know,
he's such a great character. Like,
I love Teclis. So that was a bit controversial, but I then popped in. Look, it's in the Jade Wizard background. This is where they came from, and I'm reinstating that and making sure that it's clear in the current edition of the game, and it'll also marry well with whatever else you said. They were like, you know what, that's fair. But similarly, and to hark right back to almost the beginning of this stream, there was the discussion concerning the planetary system.
Right.
That got cut. That got cut. And that's an example of Games Workshop going, actually, no. We're not sure that we want to put that into place yet. And that is, I would say, broadly speaking, my experiences. But when I've been dealing with them directly, they have been nothing but, generally speaking, the best. They're awesome. I utterly adored my work with them.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear, because like I've been like really with the Total War stuff since the first game, and I've been so blessed in that, thanks to my community and stuff, I've gotten to have a lot of really personal involvement with Creative Assembly and a lot of the stuff they're doing, and it has been super interesting seeing Games Workshop evolve from things were very different during Total War Warhammer 1, you know, where the fantasy universe was kind of functionally dead in a lot of ways. And they were kind of a little more, I guess, laissez-faire, as far as like, yeah, sure, you can use Helman Gorst as a big character, whatever, who cares? Compared to now, where like they were all over the Kislev stuff and the Grand Cathay stuff, and they're like, no, you're gonna make Grand Cathay, we're gonna make you an army book. You're not gonna just do stuff. We're gonna be here, which is very exciting. But it's just interesting to see. It's so good to see them. You know, I've read a lot of really interesting kind of like little articles and talking to people who work at GW about like how excited they are about it, and a lot of like really big names coming back and writing. You know, I can't wait to see the new Bretonia and the new Tomb Kings. Like ooh, the new Bretonia. It's so exciting. It's so fascinating. And I have to say, I, as a fan and someone who like does this for a living, and like it's my life, it really truly is. It's how I've made friends. It's how I traveled, like left my home and gotten to meet people across the world and all this other stuff. Thank y'all so much. I know you're not the only one, but you're just the one I get to talk to at this moment.
Totally.
I cannot like laud enough accolades on you for keeping Warhammer alive, in that the 4th edition roleplay and like Vermintide and Total War were those little lifelines that kept fantasy alive, because it was like, you know, the end times was a thing, and the first edition of Age of Sigmar was a thing. You know, there were very different aims. Games Workshop was a very different place, it felt like, back then. You know, the CEO was a very interesting individual, and there was a lot of crazy things going on, but like it was amazing seeing all this stuff and going, we're still in this game, like we're still going, and we're living, like I am in a golden age. I literally, like 2 weeks ago, I had Games Workshop come out and release a brand new line for the Lizardmen, which is for the Seraphon and for of the old world, and the Lustria campaign book dropped, which I think the original second edition roleplay had been like, or maybe the first edition had been like, we're gonna do a Lustria book, and then it just kind of never happened. And then all of a sudden, hey, here it is 30 years later, but it's here. Here's your Lustria book.
Yep.
It's amazing. Like, the Lustria book is so good. And it's like all this stuff is happening within a week, and then the Chaos Dwarfs come back, and they're great and awesome, and like they're not, and like they're building up to them coming out in AOS, where we've got all this other stuff happening. And it's like, this is insane. This is insane to think that we went from, 20. I'll never forget being in college. I was a freshman or sophomore in college when the end times kind of was wrapping up, and it was like, oh my God, like this is not great. Like, this is really sad. And
I remember the time really well because I'd blown up my Warhammer world relatively recently. We'd reached the end of a 10-year campaign, because I don't do short campaigns. And we've been playing for 10 years. The same character that I mentioned before that's in the Tome of Salvation, she was one of the characters, Sigurd. And a character that's mentioned a few times in Fantasy Roleplay 4, Adamar, Fitztancred, Brave Wizard, he was one of the characters as well. He was mentioned a few times in the core book because Andy wrote some of the sections in that. That was one of my players. And we watched as the old world blew up. And the worst part of it was the story that we'd built, we thought was better, as is often the case. When you've spent a lot of time figuring out how it all goes. Admittedly, our story ended in the most controversial way ever for people who like to keep 40k and Warhammer separate. It was ridiculous, proper redonkulous. But if we ignore the 40k bits and just look at the Warhammer bits, it ended in a really cool way. And then watching how they destroyed the world and just going, oh, well, I suppose that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
And now it's gone. Oh, well. I spent a lot of my life working on this.
Yeah.
and now it's gone. I remember seeing a post from Gav Thorpe saying, look, don't be sad. Your job now is to go and dive into Age of Sigmar, because they're going to have a lack of writers who know it all. Just jump in there and do it. And I was like, yeah, nah, I'm quite happy. I think I might be done. I might be done.
It's like, hey, I think
I'm done.
We blew up your house, but they're making a new house out of those bits, and you know those bits, so why don't you go? It's like, I'm all right. And
I was not an easy convert. But as time went on, my it wasn't even dissatisfaction, it was apathy. That would be a better way of putting it. Just general nothingness towards it all. Slowly wore down. But the one for me that broke me and made me go, actually, I'm wrong, I'm quite digging the new stuff, was when I went down to the studio, of all things. So I was already hired to work on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4. No, beyond that, I was working as the producer for the line because I was down there to pitch some stuff about it. And I was in the studio, and they were bringing in people, and a beautiful part had just happened. I don't remember his name. Doesn't matter who it was. He came in, and he was holding the Fantasy Roleplay 4 book, and he said, this is a fucking Warhammer book. Yes! He was really excited about it.
Yeah.
And he called in some people in from the studio and went, look at this. This is what I was talking about. And I was just sitting there going, that's my book. He's loving it. Excellent. Yay. It was quite a nice moment. But a whole bunch of people came in from the studio and they were showing off the new things that they had for Age of Sigmar. And he brought in the just freshly painted and finished Slanesh models. And I just looked at them. And they're obviously the studio painted ones as well, so they were painted slightly good.
Yeah, heavy metal painting, as they said back in the day.
I was holding it like this, going, "Holy shit, this is good! Holy shit, that is a greater Demon of Slanesh. Look at this thing! Look at that thing having its butt plopped."
Yeah.
And I was like, I want to be doing Age of Sigmar now. Oh, God damn it, I've just been converted. So my first question was, hey, can I use these demons in this type of description in Warhammer, please? And they said yes. And I was like, excellent. Best of both worlds. Woo! There was actually a bit of a conversation about that, because they were like, are they the same? It's like, well, of course they are. They're the same. 40k Warhammer Age of Sigmar. You can use them. And I was like, I'm so using those because they're freaking gorgeous.
Demons are always the best. They are canon in everything.
Yeah, they are the universal language. Yeah, totally. They are the lingua franca. Yeah, I very much enjoyed those models, and they were the ones that converted me.
You know, I had a very similar experience of that. Like, I was very apathetic, didn't really care for it. Like, I started kind of getting interested in like the storyline at the end of first edition because like, oh, this malign importance is kind of interesting. Like, and then they released the Night Haunt, and I saw Lady Allender and Kurdos Valentian, and I was like, oh, like I had been a Lisbon player my whole life, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh fuck, I'm collecting ghosts now, but it's been, I will say, like, as someone that like is really like, I like to think of myself as much of a Loremaster of Age of Sigmar as I am for fantasy, collecting all the books and the army books, which God, there's so many of them. There's so many factions, but like one of the things that I've loved so much is you could tell when the passion came back. Of like, it's not just like we're trying to sell models, buy our game, please. It's like, no, we're creating a world, and you started seeing all these beautiful, like almost motifs to the Warhammer Fantasy universe. Like they wouldn't necessarily bring a character back, but they'd reference them and they'd like talk about them, or there'd be a character inspired by them, and in some cases they would they've been like retconning a lot of the end time stuff in Age of Sigmar and being like, nah, that's not what happened. Here's what actually happened. And you're like, oh, that's really cool. I will never forget, like I have been, oh my God, I cannot remember his name all of a sudden off the top of my head, and it's going to horrify me. Oh God, I know he's on one of these books on this shelf. God, maybe it'll come to me in a minute. But one of the David Geimer, there we go. David Geimer wrote a series of White Dwarf articles about Grombrindal coming back. But what they didn't tell you is that it's actually from the perspective of Grugni the entire time. And the whole series is about Grugni talking about the world that was. Talking about the Warhammer world and how bad like he felt about everything and this regret. I cried reading that because it just like it just stabs at your heart of at the final story. He resurrects Grombrindal and they have this conversation of father to son about the old world falling, and you're like, what? And like he wrote the new Gotrek series, which is that series made me laugh so hard because he was like, what if Gotrek was just an angry Warhammer Fantasy fan in Age of Sigmar, where they're like, we're Dwarven. He goes, no, you're fucking dwarfs. Dwarven is not a word. And like, it's great. And it's like, but it's like, there's all these cool little things where they're like, oh, flesh eater courts. Yeah, they're pretty cool. What if we told you that Ushoran is the origin of them still, and that he got out and he's wandering around somewhere, and you're like, oh shit, Nagash may have a baddie to deal with. Or like, Or like, hey, you know how the Skaven fucked over Nagash multiple times in fantasy? Well, guess who screws up Nagash's plan in AOS? And it's like, this is amazing. Like it's seeing the world, like it's still its own thing. It's still its own complete identity, but it's so beautifully interwoven that it's like, now if you know fantasy, you just get more out of it instead of less, which is,
well, to begin with, it had to carve out its own unique identity.
Yeah.
They didn't make it unique in that they didn't say it had nothing to do with anything else. They very much said this is what comes after. But they were driving down hard on it being unique and its own thing. And the fear that came with having too many ties to Warhammer and people wanting it to be Warhammer and not being quite there just eroded over time. And accepting that it was Warhammer 30k. To 40k.
Yeah.
You know, it's the world that was is effectively Warhammer 30k, and using that also effectively as a driving marketing line. That's, I think, an interesting. Well, we all know how big the Horus Heresy is.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's effectively their Horus Heresy setting, and they've decided to plumb back to and effectively recreate the Horus Heresy by having Azavar Khan, his big, massive drive down for the Great War against Chaos.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if I'm more excited for Magnus or Azavar Kul, like getting like minis, because I know they're both gonna have minis, and like I've never even seen Azavar Kul. Like I think Chaos Bane.
There's a marvelous picture of not him that I did in the book Empire at War. So in the Empire at War book, at the very bottom of the map that I did of the Battle for Kislev Gate, there's a bunch of shields for each one of the units that are on the map.
Uh-huh.
And beside the shield, you can see the units. So, for example, beside the shield of the Ice Queen is charging forward out of it. Azavar Kul is behind the shield. because you can't depict the Everchosen because that's blasphemous. But I purposely avoided depicting him in any way, shape, or form because it meant that I'd never need to worry about accidentally contradicting something that came later.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was quite a fun one. Throwing the Ice Queen on that one was good.
Yeah, I'm so excited for everything that's going to happen there. And I'm glad. I will say, when they first announced it, I was really worried it was just going to be pigeonholed to the Empire. But the fact we're getting like Cetra and Cetra's like invasion of the old, like Cetra's getting involved, it's like, oh, I can't wait to see a new Cetra the Imperishable mini. Like, as much as I love the old Two King minis, those skeleton horses were rough.
They're old.
Yeah,
they're definitely old.
And like, it's truly, I can't wait.
Yep, me too. I'm very much. I'm looking forward to seeing all the things that they do and how I can then incorporate that into the games that I play. Because as a creator on the roleplay side, I can't help but be building stuff constantly, whether it's for my own games, professionally, or whatever. And just the idea of this great wealth of new material coming is extraordinarily exciting. And as I mentioned way earlier in the thread, it's going to overwrite large chunks of the game that I may have written already. But that, as I've said before, isn't something that bothers me. If anything, it excites me because then I can say, well, why do the people in my game believe it's the other way? When actually what it was this way. And I think that's something that games like, to really go back to early in the stream, games like Dragon Age do very well, where they establish a setting, they teach you the setting, and then they show you what happened. And you realize that the truth is not what everyone thinks it is.
Yeah,
that's very much at the very core of what the next game they're going to release.
And that's also like, that's what history is. Like,
yeah, it is. Absolutely.
It's not what actually happened. It's just kind of what an interpretation of the winners said what happened.
Indeed. And some of the fun is plumbing down into the truth that lies behind the fables that are told. It's certainly one of the fun aspects of role-playing games in general, where particularly for fans of the setting who have an expectation of it being one way, and then find a fact that says, actually, it might be different. It always makes for an exciting and compelling story. Yeah, totally.
Well, God, this has been so much fun, and I would love to.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Going for eternity, but I know my Sunday game of The Enemy Within starts in 30 minutes, and my GM will shoot me if I am
enjoy it
instead. Yeah, so just a fun little thing. So I'm playing a Witch Hunter. Been having a really good time with it. We failed Bogenhofen. It blew up.
Yes!
Yeah, so
brilliant.
We set up like this beautiful scheme to capture all the bad guys together, and I'd never played The Enemy Within before, so I didn't know who the actual bad guy was or any of that stuff. And it turned out that stupid little bastard demon of his that was helping him out had shapeshifted into him, so the real guy we needed was somewhere else. And we had our chance to catch the demon, and we failed to catch him because the damn pursuit rolls just screwed us. So demon gets away, ritual goes off, so Bogenhofen's, they summon Kairos Fate Weaver. He starts eating everybody. We have to, our GM's like, all right, so we're trying to get out of the city. We're like, okay, let's go to the stables. We get to the stables, and the GM's like, yeah, all of your horses were mutated together into a giant chaos spawn. So we have to fight this stupid bastard chaos spawn. And I'm sitting there like, I spent so much gold on this horse, and now I gotta kill it. And we get on our boat, we flee the city. We have this whole thing of one of our character. We have this girl in our party who's very empathetic, and we have these refugees with them. And my witch hunter's talking. All of a sudden, my witch hunter realizes that one of the refugees has a third eye on the back of her head, and he's like, So I killed a lot of the refugees because it's like, all right, anyone who has a mutation or is having weird dreams, you go into this pile. Everyone else goes into this pile, and this pile, look away. And it's like,
it's a grim and perilous world.
Yeah, and dealing with the fallout so we're in Death of the Reich right now, and it was great. I had my character go into the flagellant career for a little while because I'm like, hey, he feels awful about he failed his job. And he finished with that, and I went into runner got my movement up to 5, and then got also sprint and everything. I was like, never again will a demon outrun me. Never again.
Good times.
Thousands of people died because I could not run fast enough. Anyway,
there's a lovely, just to finish on that, a lovely picture at the very end of the book, again done by Sam. I don't know if you've seen it, the one with the greater demon arriving.
Yes.
and there's a tiny, tiny, tiny little dwarf slayer hanging off.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, yeah. He's sitting there. Kairos is sitting there eating people, and it's like, and then there's that one brave slayer. Yeah, my GM was like, "Yeah, you'll need to flee the city." And I was like, "I can't flee. Are you kidding?" And he's like, "What are you gonna do?" And it's like, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna roll a cool check. If I pass, my character is like, "No, I gotta go warn the Emperor. I gotta go warn people." And if I fail, then I'm gonna say, "Fuck it, I'm gonna stay." And I passed the check. And it was like, "Damn it!" All right, let's go. Anyway, could you tell?
Yes, you've got to go.
Yeah, could you tell all the glorious people in chat where we can find you? Because like you've talked about blogs, you've talked about streaming. Like there's a lot of things people want to watch.
Right. Well, let's bring up some things. Right. First, I stream weekly, although we're between seasons. I stream weekly with people across the games industry for Inside the Rookery. Wait a minute. Do I have your chat open? I might even be able to post it in chat. I can. Look at that. It's magic. Awesome. Let me post a comment.
Please
I can do it.
I'm gonna give you...
I've got chat rules. Okay, I've got it. Chat rules. That's the YouTube account for it. So that's the Rookery. You'll find 4 seasons worth of game chat. Some of it's Warhammer chat as well. We include Andy Hall in amongst all of that because we had a lovely chat with him just before the Chaos Dwarves were released.
Yep.
So that's number 1. Number 2, I also stream mapping for Warhammer Bits and Bobs, but that's going to be where the same channel is going to be where I do all the streaming for the Enemy Within. So I'll pop that up as well. So let me just grab that. I'm going to grab a comment like so. Discord, no. YouTube, that's it. There
Rookery
we go. That's that one.
There we go. Let's get that fancy VIP there. There we go. Now people can see easier.
There we go. So hopefully I'll pop in. I'm a VIP.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm very, very important now. I shall fix my imaginary tie. Okay, so that's the YouTube. So that's just the 2 YouTube channels. That'll give you links to wherever else if you drop in there. The big one for following me, if you want to find me, is on Twitter at Epimaces. So if I just write at Epimaces, that will give you something to find. At Epimaces like so. Did that go in? Or did it just say at Epimaces? Oh, come on. Oh,
there you go. Yeah.
That's my Twitter person thing.
All right, and I will
there. You'll find me and follow me and do whatever you do when you're online. And that's that. Other than that, if you're into role playing, we will have all manner of cool system-free role playing bits and bobs that you'll be able to play with Warhammer if you're playing Warhammer, or if you're a D&D fan or anything else fan, you'll be able to play it with that too, because we are not quite so exclusive as just to do Warhammer things.
That's so awesome.
That's gonna be all kinds of awesome.
Yeah, the ship, full ship, I think is what you call
Ship of Fools.
Ship of Fools.
Ship of Fools.
I know it's not going to be out in time to do it, but like, because my campaign on Thursday, we're starting in Salzamund, and I'm playing a skink that has gotten there, and so the character, everyone else is a human character, has to be introduced to my skink, and then we're sailing to Lustria, so we can do some Sea of Claw stuff, and it's like, that sounds perfect for what's probably going to happen on that boat.
Yeah, it's wait till you see some of the art for this. Oh man, I'm just imagining something. This is some of the people in the Ship of Fools are, for example, a hen party. Do you know what a hen party is? It's a very UK version of a bachelorette party.
Yeah, a bachelorette party. Oh Jesus.
Okay, so we've got that. Okay, and they're all halflings. So it's a halfling bachelorette party, and Huz Mark figured out a really good way to give them all giant hats that look like what you would expect a bachelorette party to be wearing. Yes, he does. They're astonishingly ridiculous. I love them. And as you'll know from he did obviously all the work for the good old Chaos Dwarves back in the day. He knows how to do a hat.
Yes, oh man. Now I'm imagining Chaos Dwarves with phallic hats.
Well, you said it. I mean, some of the old the ones for the support weapon. The rocket launcher. I
mean, it's like
very phallic-like hats.
I could see some Chaos Dwarves being like, "No, we're not compensating for anything. What are you talking about?
Not at all.
We're not." Okay.
Good times.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. And, of course, a raid just shows up as we're ending. I'm so sorry for those who raided. I will have this posted up on YouTube. I'll also port it over all the different podcast sites for people who just want to listen. And on those in the descriptions will be all the links to all the Andy stuff, which you should absolutely check out because that's where I'll be there. So thank you all so much for watching. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream so that me and him can end up, and I'll talk to you all later. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.